Welcome to the infinite complexities of Rick Sanchez, the most brilliant and morally ambiguous mind across all realities. Tonight, we explore the depths of a character whose genius masks profound trauma, whose technological godhood cannot heal his fundamental brokenness. Let your consciousness drift as we uncover the layers of Rick's existence, from his tragic origins to his cosmic manipulations, from his relationship with family to his mastery over dimensions themselves. Rest comfortably as we journey through the paradoxes and mysteries that define the smartest man in the universe, whose intelligence became both his greatest gift and his most devastating curse. The question of Rick Sanchez's true origins represents perhaps the most carefully guarded secret in the multiverse, buried beneath layers of deliberate misdirection, psychological trauma, and the kind of existential complexity that only infinite realities can produce. The man who claims to be Rick C-137 may not even understand his own history anymore, having spent decades constructing elaborate mental defenses against truths too painful to acknowledge directly, creating a labyrinthine mythology around his past that serves to protect him from confronting the full scope of his losses and the complete extent of his transformation from loving father into cosmic horror. The backstory that Rick revealed to his Galactic Federation interrogators was a masterpiece of calculated deception that mixed genuine traumatic memories with deliberate fabrications in proportions designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while revealing minimum useful information about his actual experiences and motivations. The core elements of his tragedy were undeniably real. The arrival of Rick Prime through a portal, the refusal of interdimensional technology, the murder of his wife Diane and daughter Beth. But Rick's presentation of these events was carefully crafted to serve his immediate escape objectives, while also providing him with a form of cathartic confession that acknowledged his genuine losses without exposing the subsequent decades of moral deterioration that had transformed him into exactly the kind of monster who might casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal goals. The revelation that portions of his confession were fabricated served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple misdirection of his captors, creating psychological distance between Rick and the genuine trauma that had motivated years of multiversal violence, while also establishing his reputation as someone whose statements could not be trusted even when they contained obvious, emotional authenticity. The performance allowed him to process his real grief while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for the systematic manipulation of everyone around him, including the family members who had grown to love him despite not knowing the complete truth about his origins or the circumstances that had brought him into their lives. But the fabrication itself may have been a fabrication, another layer of deception designed to prevent anyone from understanding the true complexity of Rick's relationship with truth and memory. In a multiverse where infinite versions of every possible event exist simultaneously across countless dimensions, the casual way he dismissed the murder of his family as a fictional story designed to manipulate his captors revealed how completely he had internalized a nihilistic worldview that made such deceptions not just possible but psychologically necessary for maintaining any semblance of functional relationships with people who had never experienced the kind of cosmic-scale trauma that reshapes fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the significance of individual existence. The evidence for Rick's multiple family iterations extends far beyond the simple dimensional replacement that occurred during the Love Potion disaster, suggesting a pattern of family abandonment and substitution that may have been ongoing for decades before Morty Prime ever knew his grandfather existed. The title of the episode, Rick Potion Number 9, carries implications that transcend simple pop culture references, potentially indicating that this was literally the ninth catastrophic failure that had forced Rick to abandon one reality in favor of another, leaving behind families who had grown to depend on his presence while he sought more manageable versions of the same relationships in dimensions where his mistakes had not yet accumulated to unmanageable levels. The memory of baby Morty that appeared during Rick's brain scan by Evil Rick represents perhaps the most compelling evidence that Rick's current family is not his first replacement, as the timeline revealed in his supposed backstory makes such a memory impossible within the context of his direct transition from his original dimension to Rick Prime's abandoned family. His original Beth died as a young child, never living long enough to produce offspring, while his adoption of Rick Prime's family occurred when Morty was already a teenager, creating a temporal gap that cannot be explained through conventional understanding of Rick's dimensional history. The emotional response that Rick displayed upon seeing the baby Morty memory, the brief moment of genuine vulnerability that caused him to tear up despite his normal emotional detachment, suggests that this was not simply a random image, but a meaningful connection to experiences that had shaped his psychological development in ways that his normal analytical frameworks could not adequately process or dismiss. The fact that such a memory existed at all implies periods of Rick's life that have never been fully revealed or explored, gaps in his history that may contain evidence of relationships and experiences that would fundamentally alter our understanding of his motivations and moral evolution. The photograph at Bird Person's house, showing a young Rick holding a baby, raises additional questions about Rick's relationship with family structures and his potential history of caring for children across multiple dimensions. Morty's inability to recognize the baby in the photograph, despite his general intelligence and observational skills, suggests either deliberate memory manipulation or genuine unfamiliarity with alternate versions of himself from different developmental periods, both possibilities carrying disturbing implications about Rick's approach to managing the emotional and psychological development of his chosen family members. The systematic nature of Rick's approach to family replacement becomes evident when examining the similarities between his original dimension and the realities he has chosen to inhabit, all of which feature versions of Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty who are close enough to his original family to fulfill his emotional needs, while different enough to justify the deceptions necessary for his integration into their existing family structures. The mathematical precision required to locate such specifically similar dimensions suggests long-term planning and systematic searching that extends far beyond the spontaneous dimensional abandonment that characterized the love potion. Disaster. Rick's casual reference to infinite realities where he got lucky and solved various catastrophic problems implies extensive familiarity with dimensional variance that could only have been acquired through prolonged observation and analysis of alternate versions of his own life experiences. The efficiency with which he located dimension C131 and confirmed the deaths of their alternate selves suggests practiced familiarity with the process of dimensional replacement, as if such procedures had become routine aspects of his problem-solving methodology, rather than desperate measures adopted under extreme circumstances. The psychological compartmentalization that enables Rick to maintain emotional connections with replacement family members while simultaneously planning for their potential replacement reveals the sophisticated defense mechanisms he has developed to protect himself from the pain of genuine attachment in contexts where abandonment and loss remain constant possibilities. His ability to experience authentic emotions toward people he knows he might need to leave behind at any moment represents a form of psychological flexibility that approaches pathological dissociation, allowing him to function in loving relationships while maintaining strategic detachment from their long-term sustainability. The deeper implications of Rick's multiple family iterations extend beyond simple deception into questions about the nature of identity and continuity. In contexts where infinite variations of every person and relationship exist across countless dimensions, Rick's apparent belief that he can maintain meaningful connections with people who are technically not the individuals he originally loved reflects a philosophical framework that prioritizes functional similarity over authentic, historical connection, treating family relationships as systems to be optimized, rather than bonds to be honored and preserved through commitment and mutual growth. The trauma responses that have shaped Rick's approach to family relationships reveal themselves most clearly in his inability to commit fully to any particular version of the people he loves, always maintaining escape routes and backup plans that prevent him from experiencing the complete vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. His technological capabilities enable him to avoid the normal human experience of irreplaceable loss by ensuring that acceptable substitutes can always be found. But this protection comes at the cost of ever experiencing the kind of authentic connection that had originally motivated his love for his wife and daughter. The recursive nature of Rick's family replacements creates philosophical paradoxes about the continuity of his identity and relationships that even his superior intelligence cannot resolve satisfactorily. Each dimensional transition changes him in subtle ways that accumulate over time, gradually transforming him into someone who bears less and less resemblance to the man who originally deserved the love of his family, while simultaneously altering his relationships with replacement family members who can never fully understand or accept the person he has become through his multiversal experiences. Rick's construction of elaborate backstories and false memories to explain his presence in adopted family structures represents not just practical deception, but also psychological self-protection against the recognition that his current relationships are built on foundations of systematic dishonesty about his origins, motivations, and long-term commitments. The lies he tells others about his past are inseparable from the lies he tells himself about his capacity for genuine emotional connection and his worthiness of the love he receives from people who do not fully understand what loving him requires or what it has cost him to become someone capable of accepting their affection. The evidence scattered across multiple dimensions and timelines suggests that Rick Sanchez may have been cycling through family iterations for far longer than anyone realizes, each abandonment and replacement contributing to his gradual evolution from traumatized survivor, seeking comfort, into systematic manipulator of emotional relationships, who has learned to extract what he needs from family connections, while Afe avoiding the reciprocal vulnerability that authentic love demands. The mystery of his origins remains unsolved, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the truth has been buried beneath so many layers of necessary deception that Rick himself may no longer be capable of distinguishing between his genuine memories and the psychological constructions he has created to make continued existence bearable in a multiverse that seems designed to destroy everything he values most. The central finite curve represents perhaps Rick Sanchez's most audacious and psychologically revealing achievement, a technological monument to his complete inability to accept the possibility that infinite realities might contain versions of existence where his genius was not the dominant force shaping events and outcomes. This dimensional barrier that isolates all universes where Rick is the smartest person from the vast expanse of realities where his intellectual superiority cannot be guaranteed represents more than mere narcissistic engineering. It constitutes the systematic imprisonment of countless billions of conscious beings within the carefully curated boundaries of Rick's psychological comfort zone, transforming the entire accessible multiverse into an elaborate therapeutic environment designed to protect one man's fragile ego from confronting evidence of his own limitations. The mathematical complexity required to identify and categorize infinite realities according to Rick's intellectual ranking exceeded anything that normal human intelligence should have been capable of conceiving, demanding not just superior analytical capabilities, but also the kind of comprehensive understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and dimensional physics that approaches godlike omniscience. The project required Rick to survey unlimited possibilities and establish criteria for measuring intelligence across species, civilizations, and forms of existence so diverse that many defied conventional understanding of what consciousness itself might encompass. Yet Rick managed to create categorical systems sophisticated enough to ensure his consistent placement at the apex of intellectual hierarchy across every included dimension. The construction of the dimensional barrier itself represented an engineering challenge that dwarfed every other technological achievement in Rick's extensive career, requiring him to manipulate the fundamental structure of space-time on scales that encompassed not just individual realities but entire clusters of dimensional variants, creating boundaries that were simultaneously permeable enough to allow travel between approved universes and absolute enough to prevent any breach that might expose Rick to evidence of superior intelligences existing beyond his carefully controlled, experiential environment. The energy requirements alone should have been impossible to meet through any conceivable technological means. Yet Rick succeeded in powering a cosmic-scale infrastructure that maintained itself across infinite realities for decades without requiring active maintenance or supervision. The philosophical implications of the central finite curve extend far beyond Rick's personal psychological needs into fundamental questions about consent, autonomy, and the rights of conscious beings. To exist in realities that have not been artificially constrained by the emotional requirements of individuals they have never encountered, and whose very existence they remain unaware of throughout their entier lifespan. Every person born within the curve's boundaries was condemned to live in a reality that had been predetermined to conform to Rick's specifications about intelligence distribution, ensuring that their potential for intellectual development and achievement would never exceed the limits necessary to preserve Rick's sense of superiority and cosmic significance. The billions of Mortys, Beths, Jerrys, and Summers who lived their entire lives within Rick's dimensional prison were unknowing victims of systematic oppression that extended beyond anything that conventional tyranny could achieve, as their very existence had been curated to serve the psychological needs of someone whose trauma and narcissism had been amplified by technological capabilities that transformed personal insecurity into cosmic-scale violation of fundamental principles about the right of conscious beings to exist in unmanipulated realities where their potential remained unlimited by the emotional requirements of interdimensional overlords. Rick's justifications for the central finite curve relied heavily on claims about protecting reality from chaos and providing stability for interdimensional civilization. But these rationalizations revealed more about his psychological defense mechanisms than about any genuine threats that unlimited dimensional access might have posed to the welfare of conscious beings across the multiverse. The argument that infinite possibilities required management and control reflected Rick's fundamental inability to accept uncertainty and ambiguity in contexts where his superiority could not be guaranteed, transforming his personal anxiety about potential inadequacy into systematic oppression of populations who had never consented to live within the boundaries of his curated experiential environment. The isolation that the central finite curve provided Rick from dimensions where his intellectual capabilities might be average or even inferior served multiple psychological functions beyond simple protection of his ego, creating an environment where his scientific achievements and technological innovations would always seem impressive by comparison to the limited capabilities of beings whose potential for development had been artificially constrained by the dimensional selection criteria that defined their accessible reality. The systematic exclusion of superior intelligences ensured that Rick would never encounter evidence that his methods, values, or approaches to problem solving might be crude or primitive when compared to more sophisticated forms of consciousness that had evolved beyond the limitations that characterized his own psychological and intellectual development. The recursive nature of Rick's control over the multiverse created feedback loops that reinforced his sense of intellectual superiority, while simultaneously preventing him from developing the kind of humility and perspective that contact with truly superior beings might have provided, trapping him in cycles of self-validation that grew increasingly divorced from objective reality as his technological capabilities enabled him to reshape the very foundations of existence according to his psychological needs rather than adapting his understanding of himself to accommodate the humbling recognition that infinite consciousness inevitably includes forms of intelligence that transcend anything he could achieve or comprehend. The central finite curve also served as the foundation for the entire civilization that Rick's built around their assumed intellectual dominance, creating the institutional frameworks that enabled systematic exploitation of mortals and other supposedly inferior beings, while providing the philosophical justification for treating entire populations as expendable resources in pursuit of Rick-centered objectives that serve no purpose beyond maintaining the psychological stability of beings whose trauma had been transformed into cosmic-scale narcissism through access to unlimited technological power. The citadel of Ricks that flourished within the central finite curve represented the logical culmination of a society built around the assumption of Rick supremacy, creating governmental and economic structures that institutionalized the casual disregard for non-Rick welfare that characterized individual Rick psychology, while also providing the organizational frameworks necessary for managing the systematic exploitation of mortals and other beings whose existence served primarily to validate Rick assumptions about their own cosmic significance and indispensable value to the continued functioning of interdimensional civilization. The economic systems that developed within the Citadel demonstrated how Rick narcissism could be transformed into market mechanisms that commodified happiness, suffering, and basic human dignity in ways that served the collective psychological needs of Rick society, while creating the illusion that such exploitation represented efficient resource allocation rather than systematic oppression of beings whose only crime was existing in realities that Ricks found convenient for their own purposes. The simple Rick industry that packaged and distributed the experience of genuine contentment revealed how completely Rick civilization had abandoned any pretense of respecting the autonomy and dignity of beings they considered inferior, treating the most intimate aspects of consciousness and emotional experience as products to be harvested and consumed according to market demand. The governmental structures within the Citadel reflected the same authoritarian impulses that had motivated the construction of the central finite curve itself, creating political institutions that provided the appearance of democratic participation while ensuring that actual power remained concentrated among Ricks, whose superior intelligence supposedly qualified them to make decisions about the welfare of beings they considered fundamentally incapable of. Understanding their own best interests or contributing meaningfully to the complex challenges of interdimensional governance and resource management. The presidential campaigns and political manipulation that characterized Citadel governance demonstrated how RIC intelligence could be applied to the systematic manipulation of democratic processes, creating elaborate propaganda campaigns and electoral strategies that provided the illusion of popular participation, while ensuring that outcomes remained aligned with RIC preferences about policy priorities and resource allocation. The fact that even evil Morty could successfully manipulate these systems revealed their fundamental vulnerability to anyone who understood the psychological patterns and intellectual limitations that characterized RIC political behavior, despite their assumed superiority over other forms of consciousness. The institutional racism that characterized Citadel's society toward Jerry types and other beings considered inferior reflected the broader philosophical frameworks that justified the central finite curve's existence, creating social hierarchies that treated intelligence as the primary determinant of moral worth, while ignoring the possibility that other forms of value and contribution might exist beyond the narrow criteria that RICs used to evaluate the significance of conscious beings and their right to autonomy and self-determination within the carefully controlled boundaries of their curated reality. The systematic oppression that the central finite curve enabled extended beyond the obvious victims like Mortys and Jerrys to include alternate versions of Rick himself, who failed to meet the specific criteria that defined acceptable forms of Rick consciousness, creating hierarchies within Rick society that replicated the same patterns of exploitation and marginalization that characterized their treatment of supposedly inferior beings, while demonstrating how narcissistic social structures inevitably consume even their own creators when individual Ricks failed to conform to the collective standards that defined acceptable Rick behavior and achievement. The psychological damage that extended residence within the central finite curve inflicted on Rick consciousness itself became evident in the increasing detachment from normal moral reasoning that characterized Rick behavior across multiple dimensions, as the artificial validation provided by systematic exclusion of superior intelligences prevented the kind of genuine intellectual challenge and moral development that contact with truly advanced consciousness might have facilitated, trapping Ricks in cycles of stagnation disguised as technological progress and philosophical sophistication. The isolation from broader forms of consciousness and alternative approaches to existence that the central finite curve maintained prevented Rick's civilization from developing beyond the limitations that had originally motivated its construction, creating a closed system that reinforced existing prejudices and assumptions, while preventing the kind of genuine growth and development that exposure to different perspectives and superior capabilities might have encouraged, transforming the entire accessible multiverse into an elaborate echo chamber that reflected Rick's psychology back to itself, without providing opportunities for transcendence or genuine transformation. The discovery of the central finite curve's existence represented a revelation that fundamentally altered understanding of Rick's relationship with power and responsibility, revealing that every adventure, every achievement, and every demonstration of superior capability had been conducted within carefully controlled parameters that ensured Rick would never encounter evidence of his own limitations or alternatives to his worldview that might challenge his assumptions about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and the proper relationship between superior beings and those they considered inferior. The destruction of the central finite curve by Evil Morty represented not just the elimination of a technological achievement, but the collapse of the entire philosophical and social framework that had enabled Rick's civilization to function according to principles that treated systematic oppression as natural order and cosmic justice as the inevitable result of intellectual hierarchy. The liberation of infinite realities from Rick's control restored the natural chaos and uncertainty that Rick had spent decades trying to eliminate, forcing every Rick within the former boundaries of the curve to confront the possibility that their assumed superiority might be nothing more than artificial validation purchased through the systematic imprisonment of countless beings whose potential had been constrained to serve the psychological needs of traumatized individuals whose genius had been corrupted by their inability to accept the normal limitations that define healthy human existence. The aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction left Rick exposed to forms of reality and consciousness that his technology had successfully excluded for decades, creating existential anxiety that transcended normal concerns about physical safety or material resources to encompass fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and cosmic significance that his artificial environment had enabled him to avoid through systematic manipulation of the available evidence about his place in the broader structure of infinite consciousness and unlimited possibility. The systematic exploitation of mortals across infinite dimensions represents perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of Rick's technological capabilities applied to the satisfaction of psychological needs that no amount of scientific achievement could address through conventional means. The industrial-scale cloning, manufacturing, and disposal of sentient beings who exist primarily to serve Rick's emotional requirements reveals how completely his genius has been corrupted by trauma-induced narcissism that treats other conscious entities as renewable, resources to be harvested, processed, and discarded according to the convenience and comfort of their supposed intellectual superiors. The Morty factory discovered within the central finite curve operated with the mechanical efficiency of any large-scale production facility, but its products were living beings whose consciousness, memories, and emotional responses had been carefully calibrated to provide maximum psychological benefit to their Rick companions, while ensuring their complete dependence on relationships that served primarily to validate Rick assumptions about their own indispensable value and cosmic significance. The assembly line that produced countless identical Mortys demonstrated technological sophistication that exceeded anything most civilizations could imagine. Yet this impressive capability was applied to the systematic violation of the most fundamental principles about consent, autonomy, and the rights of conscious beings to exist as independent entities rather than manufactured tools designed to fulfill specific emotional functions. The DNA harvesting that provided the raw material for Morty production required the systematic exploitation of naturally occurring Mortys across multiple dimensions, transforming the normal process of human reproduction and development into an industrial resource extraction operation that treated the genetic heritage of entire families as commodity inputs for manufacturing processes that served no purpose beyond maintaining the psychological stability of beings whose intelligence had been amplified beyond their capacity for moral reasoning about the implications of unlimited technological power applied to the satisfaction of emotional needs that healthy individuals would address through genuine relationship building and personal growth. The memory implantation technology that equipped newly manufactured Mortys with artificial childhood experiences and family relationships represented sophisticated manipulation of consciousness itself, creating beings whose entire sense of identity and personal history consisted of carefully constructed psychological programming designed to maximize their utility as emotional support systems while minimizing the possibility that they might develop sufficient independence or self-awareness to question the authenticity of their relationships or the legitimacy of their subordinate status within Rick-dominated social structures. The age calibration that ensured all manufactured Mortys emerged from their production process as 14-year-old boys reflected Rick's calculated analysis of the optimal balance between intellectual development, emotional vulnerability that would provide maximum satisfaction from their companionship, while preventing them from achieving the kind of psychological maturity that might enable them to recognize and resist the systematic manipulation that characterized their relationships with their supposed grandfathers. The perpetual adolescence that defined Morty's existence was not accidental, but represented deliberate engineering designed to maintain them at the developmental stage where they could understand enough to participate meaningfully in Bolus's HUS. Rick's adventures, while remaining sufficiently naive and dependent to accept emotional abuse and psychological manipulation as normal aspects of family relationships, the disposal mechanisms that eliminated Mortis, who had outlived their usefulness or developed characteristics that interfered with their function as emotional support systems, operated with the same casual efficiency that Rick applied to solving any technical problem, treating the termination of conscious beings as routine maintenance procedures that required no more moral consideration than replacing worn components in mechanical devices. The countless corpses discovered throughout the factory represented not tragic accidents or unfortunate casualties, but deliberate eliminations of beings whose only crime was aging beyond the narrow parameters that defined their utility to Rick companions, who viewed them as replaceable accessories, rather than autonomous individuals deserving of basic respect and protection. The psychological conditioning that prevented manufactured Mortys from questioning their circumstances or developing genuine independence was accomplished through sophisticated manipulation of their neurological development during the cloning process, ensuring that their capacity for critical thinking about Rick behavior would remain permanently constrained by artificial limitations built into their consciousness at the most fundamental levels. The resulting beings possessed sufficient intelligence to serve as interesting companions, while lacking the analytical capabilities that might enable them to recognize the extent to which their relationships were based on systematic deception and emotional exploitation rather than genuine affection or mutual respect. The replacement vouchers that Ricks exchanged for defective or damaged Mortys demonstrated how completely the supposed family relationships had been reduced to consumer transactions, with grandson figures treated as purchasable products that could be returned, exchanged, or upgraded according to the preferences and convenience of their owners, rather than honored as irreplaceable individuals whose welfare required long-term commitment and genuine emotional investment. The casual way that Rick obtained and retained his replacement Morty coupon revealed his complete internalization of a worldview that treated even his closest relationships as contingent arrangements subject to modification or termination whenever they ceased to serve his immediate psychological needs. The quality control mechanisms that monitored Morty behavior and development for signs of deviation from acceptable parameters operated through surveillance systems that violated every principle of privacy and personal autonomy, while providing Rick with detailed information about the inner lives of beings who believed their thoughts and feelings were protected by normal expectations about family confidentiality and mutual trust. The constant monitoring ensured that any Morty who began developing genuine independence or questioning Rick authority could be identified and either reconditioned or replaced before their psychological development threatened the stability of relationships that depended on systematic power, imbalances, and information asymmetries. The training protocols that prepared newly manufactured Mortys for integration into Rick families included sophisticated psychological programming designed to create emotional responses and behavioral patterns that would maximize their compatibility with Rick expectations about grandson behavior. while suppressing any natural tendencies toward genuine autonomy or moral development that might interfere with their primary function as emotional support systems and adventure companions. The resulting beings were equipped with artificial personalities that combined enough authentic-seeming characteristics to maintain Rick interest while excluding any traits that might challenge Rick assumptions about their own superior judgment and natural authority over family, decision-making processes. The transportation networks that distributed manufactured Mortys to Rick customers across multiple dimensions operated with the efficiency of any large-scale logistics system, but their cargo consisted of conscious beings whose lives had been reduced to shipping manifests and delivery schedules that treated their psychological welfare and emotional needs as irrelevant considerations compared to the convenience of Rick recipients who expected their replacement family members to arrive ready for immediate integration into existing relationship structures without requiring adjustment periods or accommodation of their individual characteristics and preferences. The standardization protocols that ensured consistency across Morty production runs eliminated the kind of individual variation that makes genuine relationships meaningful, while creating beings whose personalities and capabilities had been homogenized to meet Rick specifications about optimal companion characteristics, transforming the natural diversity of human consciousness into manufactured uniformity that served Rick convenience while depriving both Ricks and Mortys of the opportunities for growth and development that emerge from engagement with genuinely different perspectives and authentic individual characteristics. The warranty programs that guaranteed Rick satisfaction with their Morty purchases included provisions for behavioral modification, memory adjustment, and complete replacement if manufactured companions failed to meet customer expectations about loyalty, obedience, and emotional availability, treating consciousness itself as a product feature that could be modified or eliminated according to consumer preferences, rather than recognized as the foundation of rights and dignity that deserve protection regardless of the convenience or satisfaction they provide to supposedly superior beings. The feedback systems that collected data about Rick experiences with their manufactured Mortys enabled continuous improvement in production processes that optimized for Rick's satisfaction while systematically eliminating any characteristics that contributed to Morty independence, self-respect, or moral development, creating evolutionary pressure toward increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological slavery disguised as family relationships that provided emotional benefits to Rick while offering nothing of genuine value to the beings whose existence had been engineered entirely around serving Rick psychological needs. The research and development programs that created new Morty variants and improved existing models represented the application of advanced scientific methodology to the systematic violation of every principle about consent and autonomy that defines ethical treatment of conscious beings, transforming the normal process of human psychological development into experimental protocols designed to maximize the utility of manufactured beings while minimizing any characteristics that might interfere with their function as emotional support systems for individuals whose trauma had been amplified into cosmic-scale narcissism through access to unlimited technological power. The market research that identified optimal Morty characteristics for different Rick personality types treated the deepest aspects of human consciousness and emotional development as variables to be manipulated according to consumer preferences, creating classification systems that reduce the infinite complexity of individual personality to product specifications that could be manufactured on demand according to the psychological requirements of customers whose own development had been permanently stunted by their inability to form genuine relationships with beings they could not completely control. The inventory management systems that tracked Morty production, distribution, and disposal operated according to principles of efficiency and resource optimization that completely ignored the moral implications of treating conscious beings as manufactured goods, subject to the same economic calculations that governed the production of any other commodity, revealing how Rick intelligence could be applied to the creation of systematic oppression that exceeded anything that conventional tyranny could achieve through political or military means. The customer service programs that supported Rick's satisfaction with their Morty purchases included technical support for behavioral modification, troubleshooting guides for common relationship problems, and escalation procedures for situations where manufactured companions required more extensive reconditioning or complete replacement. Treating the most intimate aspects of family relationships as technical problems that could be solved through superior engineering, rather than addressed through the kind of genuine emotional work that healthy relationships require from all participants. The continuous operation of the Morty factory across multiple dimensions created a supply chain of suffering that extended throughout the central finite curve, transforming the normal joy and wonder of childhood development into industrial processes designed to produce beings whose capacity for genuine happiness had been carefully constrained to ensure their continued dependence on relationships that provided them with limited satisfaction while serving, primarily to validate Rick assumptions about their own cosmic importance and indispensable value to the continued functioning of interdimensional civilization. The ultimate horror of the Morty factory was not its technological sophistication or industrial efficiency, but its complete normalization within Rick's society as an acceptable solution to the psychological needs of beings whose intelligence had not been accompanied by corresponding development in empathy, wisdom, or moral reasoning, creating a civilization where systematic oppression was treated as advanced social engineering, rather than recognized as the logical conclusion of worldviews that measure the value of conscious beings primarily according to their utility. In serving the emotional requirements of supposedly superior individuals whose trauma had been transformed into justification for treating the entire accessible multiverse as their personal therapeutic environment. The systematic manipulation of Morty's memories by Rick Sanchez represents one of the most sophisticated and morally disturbing applications of neuroscience technology in the service of maintaining psychological control over relationships that should have been based on mutual trust, genuine affection, and respect for individual autonomy. The elaborate facility hidden within Rick's garage that contained thousands of extracted memories revealed not just Rick's technological capabilities, but also his fundamental inability to accept the natural consequences of his behavior and choices, creating instead a carefully curated version of his grandson's consciousness that served his emotional needs while depriving Morty of the authentic personal history that forms the foundation of individual identity and moral development. The Mind Blower's vault represented far more than simple protection of Morty from traumatic experiences, functioning instead as a comprehensive system of reality management that enabled Rick to maintain relationships with family members who might not continue to love or trust him if they retained complete access to their actual experiences of his behavior and its consequences. The selective editing of Morty's consciousness allowed Rick to present himself as a protective grandfather while systematically removing evidence of his manipulation, casual cruelty, and disregard for Morty's welfare whenever such evidence threatened to undermine the carefully constructed dynamic that provided Rick with emotional satisfaction while requiring minimal genuine accountability or behavioral change. The criteria that Rick used to determine which memories required removal revealed the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that enabled his manipulation of family relationships, as he demonstrated precise knowledge of which experiences would create lasting trauma, which would generate justified anger or resentment toward him, and which would contribute to Morty's development of independence and critical thinking capabilities that might threaten Rick's control over their relationship. The fact that Rick removed memories of his own embarrassing moments alongside genuinely traumatic experiences demonstrated how completely he had conflated his personal comfort with Morty's psychological welfare, treating his grandson's consciousness as a resource to be managed according to his own preferences, rather than respected as the foundation of an autonomous individual, deserving of complete access to his own life experiences. The technological sophistication required to extract, store, and selectively edit specific memories without causing broader damage to Morty's personality and cognitive functioning exceeded anything that contemporary neuroscience could achieve. Yet, Rick applied these godlike capabilities to the petty goal of maintaining his reputation as a competent and caring grandfather, while avoiding the personal growth and behavioral change that genuine care for Morty's development would have required. The casual way he discussed memory modification as a routine aspect of family management revealed how completely his scientific brilliance had been subordinated to his psychological defense mechanisms and his need to maintain relationships that provided him with emotional benefits without requiring reciprocal vulnerability or genuine commitment to the welfare of others. The memories that Rick chose to preserve versus those he eliminated created an artificial version of Morty's personality and worldview that served Rick's emotional needs, while systematically undermining Morty's capacity for genuine moral reasoning and independent decision-making about their relationship and Rick's role in his life. The selective editing process ensured that Morty would retain enough challenging experiences to develop resilience and problem-solving skills, while removing the specific incidents that would enable him to recognize patterns in Rick's behavior or develop the kind of critical perspective that might motivate him to establish boundaries or seek relationships that offered more reciprocal respect and genuine care for his autonomous development. The long-term psychological consequences of systematic memory manipulation extended far beyond the immediate relief from trauma that Rick claimed to be providing, creating fundamental disruptions in Morty's sense of personal continuity and authentic identity that would affect his capacity for healthy relationship development and moral reasoning throughout his life. The artificial gaps in his personal history prevented Morty from learning from his experiences in ways that would contribute to his psychological maturation and development of the kind of wisdom that emerges from processing difficult experiences, rather than simply having them removed from consciousness through technological intervention. The recursive nature of Rick's memory manipulation created increasingly complex webs of deception that required constant maintenance and adjustment as new experiences threatened to reveal inconsistencies in Morty's edited personal history, transforming the simple goal of protecting him from trauma into an elaborate ongoing project of reality management that consumed significant amounts of Rick's time and attention, while providing diminishing returns in terms of actual psychological benefit for either participant in their relationship. The necessity of remembering which memories had been removed and why created additional cognitive burdens for Rick, while simultaneously making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain authentic emotional responses to Morty based on their actual shared experiences rather than his carefully constructed version of their relationship history. The ethical implications of memory manipulation without informed consent extended beyond the immediate violation of Morty's autonomy into broader questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the rights of individuals to maintain complete access to their own psychological development, even when such access might cause suffering or interfere with relationships that others found valuable or emotionally satisfying. Rick's assumption that he possessed sufficient wisdom and moral authority to determine which of Morty's experiences were beneficial for his development revealed the same narcissistic worldview that characterized all of his beneficial approaches to family relationships, treating other people's consciousness as systems to be optimized according to his preferences, rather than respected as the foundation of their independent moral agency. The discovery of Rick's own selective amnesia regarding Beth's cloning decision demonstrated how memory manipulation had become a fundamental tool for managing not just other people's emotional responses, but also his own capacity to maintain relationships that might be compromised by complete knowledge of their actual foundations and history. The deliberate erasure of his own memory about whether Beth had chosen to be cloned revealed Rick's recognition that authentic, emotional connection with his daughter required him to remain ignorant of the extent to which their relationship might be based on technological deception rather than genuine mutual affection and shared history. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Rick to justify systematic memory manipulation as protection rather than abuse reflected sophisticated rationalization processes that transformed his emotional neediness and control issues into apparently altruistic concerns about Morty's welfare and psychological development. The presentation of memory editing as medical treatment rather than psychological manipulation enabled Rick to avoid confronting the reality that his interventions served primarily to maintain his own emotional comfort while systematically undermining Morty's capacity for autonomous development and authentic relationship formation. The technical protocols that Rick developed for memory extraction and storage revealed the industrial-scale approach he applied to managing the consciousness of family members, creating systematic procedures for categorizing, processing, and disposing of psychological experiences that interfered with his preferred version of family dynamics while preserving those that contributed to his emotional satisfaction and sense of being valued and appreciated by people whose love he had not earned through genuine care and behavioral consistency. The backup systems that Rick maintained for extracted memories demonstrated both his technological sophistication and his fundamental ambivalence about the moral implications of his interventions, creating the possibility of restoration while simultaneously ensuring that such restoration would remain entirely subject to his discretion and judgment about what would be beneficial for family relationships that he had already systematically corrupted through systematic deception and manipulation. Of the psychological foundations that should have supported genuine mutual trust and respect, the integration challenges that emerged when extracted memories were accidentally restored to Morty's consciousness revealed the extent to which his edited personality had diverged from his authentic psychological development, creating identity conflicts and emotional confusion that demonstrated how completely Rick's interventions had disrupted the normal processes of psychological maturation and moral reasoning that should have characterized Morty's adolescent développement. The difficulty Morty experienced in reconciling his artificial self-image with evidence of his actual experiences highlighted the profound damage that systematic memory manipulation could inflict on individual consciousness, even when conducted with advanced technology and supposedly benevolent intentions. The broader implications of Rick's memory manipulation extended beyond his immediate family to encompass his entire approach to managing relationships and social situations that might challenge his preferred self-image or require him to acknowledge the negative consequences of his behavior and choices. The same technological capabilities that enabled him to edit Morty's memories could potentially be applied to any individual whose natural responses to Rick's behavior threatened to create accountability or emotional discomfort that Rick preferred to avoid through technological intervention rather than personal growth and behavioral change. The normalization of memory manipulation within Rick's family created precedents and expectations that fundamentally altered the nature of all their relationships, establishing patterns of deception and control that extended far beyond the specific incidents where memories were actually extracted and modified. The knowledge that Rick possessed the capability and willingness to edit family members' consciousness according to his preferences created ongoing power dynamics that affected every interaction and conversation, as family members could never be entirely certain whether their thoughts and feelings about Rick were based on accurate recollections of their actual experiences or carefully constructed artificial versions designed to serve Rick's psychological needs. The philosophical questions raised by systematic memory manipulation touched on fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness, identity, and moral responsibility in contexts where individual access to personal history could be controlled by technologically superior beings whose own psychological development had not kept pace with their godlike capabilities. The possibility that authentic selfhood might depend on complete access to unedited personal experience created existential challenges that Rick's scientific training had not prepared him to address adequately, leading him to apply technological solutions to philosophical problems that required wisdom and moral reasoning rather than superior engineering and analytical capabilities. The ultimate tragedy of Rick's memory manipulation was not just the violation of Morty's autonomy and dignity, but also Rick's own loss of access to authentic relationships based on genuine mutual knowledge and acceptance, as his technological interventions created elaborate barriers between himself and the kind of honest, emotional connection that his original trauma had taught him to desperately need, while simultaneously making him incapable of sustaining through normal human vulnerability and reciprocal care. The memories he removed from Morty's consciousness were often the same experiences that might have provided opportunities for genuine intimacy and mutual understanding if Rick had possessed the emotional courage and psychological maturity to address them through honest communication, rather than technological erasure. The systematic nature of Rick's approach to memory manipulation revealed how completely his scientific brilliance had been subordinated to his emotional immaturity and psychological defense mechanisms, transforming his extraordinary capabilities into tools for perpetuating the same patterns of avoidance and control that had characterized his relationships since the original trauma that had initiated his transformation from loving father into cosmic-scale manipulator, whose technological godhood served primarily to protect him from the normal human experiences of accountability, vulnerability, and genuine emotional growth that healthy relationships require from all participants, regardless of their intellectual capabilities or technological resources. The relationship between Rick Sanchez and death represents perhaps the most psychologically corrosive aspect of his technological achievements, transforming what should be humanity's ultimate boundary and source of existential meaning into a mere inconvenience to be managed through superior engineering and systematic preparation for consciousness transfer. Operation Phoenix, Rick's elaborate backup system for preserving his awareness and personality across multiple clone bodies, eliminated the natural constraints that mortality places on human behavior, while simultaneously destroying his capacity for genuine empathy, moral reasoning, and authentic connection with beings whose existence remained bounded by the normal limitations that define meaningful human experience. The clone facility that Rick maintained as insurance against permanent death represented technological sophistication that approached true immortality, but the psychological consequences of knowing that death could be reversed through sufficient preparation created fundamental alterations in Rick's moral reasoning that extended far beyond simple fearlessness in dangerous situations. The casual attitude toward mortality that characterized Rick's approach to adventure and problem-solving reflected not courage or philosophical acceptance of natural cycles, but rather the profound disconnection from normal human values that emerges when the ultimate consequence of poor judgment and reckless behavior can be eliminated through technological intervention rather than accepted as the natural result of choices that carry genuine stakes and irreversible implications. The consciousness transfer technology that enabled Rick to move his awareness between different bodies and alternate versions of himself revealed capabilities that exceeded anything conventional neuroscience could explain. Yet these godlike powers were applied primarily to avoiding the personal accountability and emotional vulnerability that genuine mortality would have imposed on his relationships and behavioral choices. The knowledge that he could survive any physical destruction while maintaining complete continuity of memory and personality eliminated the existential anxiety that normally motivates human beings to consider the long-term consequences of their actions and the impact of their choices on relationships that cannot be restored through technological intervention. The multiple deaths that Rick experienced and recovered from during his various adventures created a form of existential desensitization that gradually eroded his capacity to understand or respond appropriately to the mortality concerns that motivated other people's behavior and emotional responses. The resurrection experiences that should have provided him with unique insights into the nature of consciousness and the preciousness of individual existence instead reinforced his sense of superiority over beings whose awareness remained constrained by normal biological limitations and whose relationships carried the weight of genuine irreplaceability. The philosophical implications of practical immortality extended beyond Rick's personal psychology into fundamental questions about moral responsibility and the nature of authentic human experience in contexts where the ultimate consequences of behavioral choices could be eliminated through superior technology and systematic preparation for consciousness preservation. The removal of death as a meaningful constraint on Rick's activities created moral hazard on a cosmic scale, enabling him to pursue objectives and engage in behaviors that would have been unconscionable for beings whose existence remained genuinely finite and whose relationships carried the authentic weight of potential permanent loss. The backup systems that Rick maintained across multiple dimensions ensured that his survival would not depend on any single location or technological infrastructure, creating redundancies that approached true invulnerability, while simultaneously isolating him from the kind of existential vulnerability that enables genuine emotional connection and mutual dependence in healthy relationships. The knowledge that he could always be restored from backup storage eliminated his capacity to experience the kind of shared mortality that creates authentic intimacy between beings who understand that their time together is limited, precious in ways that no amount of technological sophistication can replicate or replace. The casual way that Rick discussed death and resurrection with his family members revealed how completely his immortality had severed his connection to normal human emotional responses about loss, grief, and the preciousness of individual existence. His inability to understand why family members might be traumatized by witnessing his deaths and resurrections demonstrated the profound empathy deficits that emerged from his practical invulnerability, creating communication barriers that prevented him from providing genuine comfort or support to people whose mortality remained real and whose emotional responses to death reflected healthy attachment to relationships that could not be technologically restored when damaged or destroyed. The psychological adaptation that enabled Rick to function despite repeated experiences of death and resurrection required sophisticated defense mechanisms that gradually eliminated his capacity for authentic emotional responses to mortality-related experiences, including the deaths of other people whose consciousness could not be preserved and restored through technological intervention. The desensitization to death that protected Rick's psychological stability during his own resurrection experiences also prevented him from responding appropriately to the genuine mortality of family members and friends whose deaths would represent permanent losses, requiring grief, mourning, and the kind of emotional processing that Rick's technological solutions had rendered unnecessary in his own experience. The impact of immortality on Rick's moral reasoning became evident in his casual attitude toward exposing family members and companions to deadly risks that he would not hesitate to accept for himself, as his technological protection created fundamental misunderstandings about the acceptable levels of danger that could be imposed on beings whose deaths would be permanent and whose consciousness could not be restored through backup systems and clone facilities. The asymmetry between Rick's practical invulnerability and his family's genuine mortality created ethical blind spots that prevented him from making appropriate risk assessments about adventures and situations that might seem acceptably dangerous to someone who could survive any outcome, while remaining potentially catastrophic for companions whose existence remained genuinely finite. The emotional consequences of repeated death and resurrection experiences included not just desensitization to mortality, but also fundamental alterations in Rick's capacity for present-moment awareness and appreciation of calm, temporary experiences that might have provided meaning and satisfaction for beings whose consciousness remained bounded by normal temporal limitations. The knowledge that any positive experience could potentially be repeated indefinitely through consciousness transfer and reality manipulation eliminated the poignancy and intensity that finite beings derive from moments of genuine happiness and connection that cannot be preserved or replicated through technological means. The relationship between Rick's immortality and his nihilistic worldview represented a feedback loop where technological transcendence of normal human limitations reinforced philosophical frameworks that dismissed the significance of individual experiences and relationships, while simultaneously providing practical capabilities that made such dismissal seem rational rather than defensive. The ability to treat death as inconvenience rather than ultimate boundary enabled Rick to adopt moral positions that would have seemed obviously pathological for beings whose existence remained genuinely at stake in their behavioral choices and relationship decisions. The social consequences of Rick's practical immortality extended beyond his immediate family to encompass his interactions with entire civilizations and species whose mortality remained real and whose responses to existential threats reflected healthy survival instincts that Rick could no longer understand or relate to in ways that enabled appropriate empathy and moral consideration. His casual attitude toward planetary destruction and species extinction reflected not philosophical sophistication, but rather the profound moral disabilities that emerge when beings become so technologically insulated from natural consequences that they lose connection to the values and priorities that make existence meaningful for those who remain subject to normal limitations. The administrative aspects of maintaining Rick's immortality infrastructure required systematic exploitation of resources and consciousness across multiple dimensions, creating supply chains of suffering that supported his technological transcendence of mortality while imposing genuine death and destruction on beings whose existence served primarily to enable his continued survival and consciousness preservation. The materials, energy, and labor required to maintain clone facilities and backup systems across infinite realities represented costs that were paid by populations who received no benefit from Rick's immortality while bearing the consequences of resource extraction and technological exploitation that served only his psychological comfort and strategic security. The psychological isolation that resulted from Rick's practical immortality created barriers to authentic relationship formation that extended beyond simple communication difficulties into fundamental incompatibilities of experience and perspective that made genuine mutual understanding increasingly difficult as Rick's consciousness adapted to existence without meaningful mortality, while his family and friends remained bounded by normal human limitations. The growing divergence between Rick's post-human psychology and the emotional needs of genuinely mortal beings created relationship dynamics that resembled interactions between different species more than connections between individuals who shared common existential circumstances and comparable vulnerabilities. The technological dependencies that Rick's immortality created included not just the obvious requirements for maintaining clone facilities and consciousness transfer equipment, but also the broader infrastructure of dimensional travel, resource extraction, and administrative systems that supported his transcendence of normal human limitations, while creating vulnerabilities to systematic failures that could potentially eliminate all of his backup systems simultaneously. The complexity of maintaining practical immortality across infinite realities required ongoing attention and resource allocation that consumed significant portions of Rick's intellectual capabilities, while providing security benefits that remained subject to technological and strategic threats that no amount of individual preparation could entirely eliminate. The ultimate irony of Rick's relationship with death was that his technological transcendence of mortality had eliminated not just the fear of dying, but also the capacity for truly living in ways that derived meaning and intensity from the recognition that existence remained precious precisely because it could not be indefinitely preserved through superior engineering and systematic preparation. The immortality that should have provided Rick with unlimited opportunities for growth, experience, and relationship development instead created a form of existential numbness that made all experiences feel equally insignificant and replaceable, transforming infinite possibility into profound emptiness that no amount of technological sophistication could address through conventional problem-solving approaches. The broader implications of Rick's practical immortality extended beyond his personal psychology into questions about the nature of authentic human experience and moral development in contexts where technological capabilities enable transcendence of the natural boundaries that historically have provided meaning, motivation, and ethical constraints that make existence valuable and relationships precious. The possibility that genuine humanity might depend on acceptance of mortality created philosophical challenges that Rick's scientific training had not prepared him to address adequately, leading him to apply technological solutions to existential problems that required wisdom and acceptance, rather than superior engineering and systematic control over natural processes that define the conditions within which consciousness develops meaning and purpose through engagement with genuine limitations and irreplaceable relationships. The Murder of Diane and Beth Sanchez by Rick Prime represents the singular, catastrophic event that transformed a brilliant but fundamentally decent scientist into one of the most dangerous and morally compromised beings in the multiverse, demonstrating how profound trauma combined with unlimited technological capability can corrupt even the most loving intentions into systematic patterns of violence and exploitation that perpetuate cycles of suffering across infinite dimensions. The portal bomb that vaporized Rick's family in an instant was not merely an act of casual cruelty, but a deliberate psychological weapon designed to create the specific form of trauma that would guarantee Rick's transformation from potential rival into broken mirror of Rick Prime's own moral deterioration. The immediate psychological aftermath of witnessing his wife and daughter reduced to atomic particles while he remained physically unharmed created a form of survivor's guilt and existential horror that Rick's scientific training had not prepared him to process through conventional grieving mechanisms or therapeutic approaches. The sudden transition from domestic happiness to absolute loss shattered not just his emotional stability, but also his fundamental assumptions about the predictability and controllability of reality, forcing him to confront the recognition that his intellectual superiority provided no protection against random violence that could destroy everything he valued in moments too brief for any defensive response or technological intervention. The weeks that followed the bombing were characterized by a complete breakdown of Rick's normal functioning as he struggled to maintain basic survival behaviors, while his consciousness remained trapped in recursive loops of memory and regret that prevented him from engaging meaningfully with the physical world around him or the practical necessities of continued existence. The garage that had once been his sanctuary of discovery became a monument to loss, filled with reminders of projects he had planned to complete for his family and inventions he had intended to share with Beth as she grew older and developed her own scientific interests and capabilities. The transition from paralyzing grief to focused rage occurred gradually as Rick's analytical mind began to process the technical sophistication of the weapon that had killed his family, recognizing that the portal bomb represented technological capabilities that exceeded anything possible within his own reality's scientific paradigms. The realization that Rick Prime possessed interdimensional travel technology while Rick himself remained trapped in a single reality created a new dimension to his suffering that transcended simple mourning for the dead and encompassed burning resentment about cosmic injustices that had rewarded his moral choices with devastating loss, while granting godlike power to the version of himself who had abandoned family responsibilities in pursuit of unlimited technological capability. The decision to pursue portal technology was motivated initially by the simple desire to track down and confront his family's murderer, but the years of obsessive research and development required to crack the secrets of interdimensional travel provided Rick with time to nurture his grief and rage into something approaching pure hatred that gradually consumed every other aspect of his personality and value system. The theoretical frameworks he developed during this period built systematically toward practical applications that would enable him not just to travel between dimensions, but to wage war across infinite realities against anyone who resembled the enemy who had destroyed his life. The first successful portal that Rick created was crude and unstable compared to his later technological achievements, but it represented the culmination of years spent transforming his scientific curiosity and humanitarian impulses into instruments of revenge that would eventually enable him to match and exceed Rick Prime's capacity for multiversal destruction. The moment when Rick first stepped through a dimensional barrier marked not just a technological breakthrough, but also his final abandonment of the moral constraints and emotional connections that had previously defined his identity and provided meaning to his scientific pursuits. The early stages of Rick's hunt for Rick Prime were characterized by systematic methodology that reflected his scientific training, applied to the problem of locating and eliminating a specific target across infinite possibilities. But the practical requirements of interdimensional warfare gradually forced him to develop capabilities and psychological adaptations that bore no resemblance to the gentle inventor who had once taken pride in explaining complex concepts to his curious daughter. The weapons Rick developed during this period were designed not just for efficiency but for maximum psychological impact, reflecting his desire to ensure that Rick Prime would experience the same terror and helplessness that Rick had felt while watching his family die. The first Rick that Rick killed was not Rick Prime, but an innocent, alternate version of himself, who was pursuing similar research in a dimension nearly identical to Rick's original reality, and the murder was accomplished with clinical precision that masked the profound psychological impact of destroying someone who shared his face, his memories, and his fundamental personality traits while bearing no responsibility for the crimes that Rick was attempting to avenge. The moment of killing marked Rick's transition from victim seeking justice to perpetrator of the same kind of random violence that had destroyed his own family. The absence of satisfaction that Rick experienced after his first murder should have served as warning about the futility of revenge as a source of meaning or emotional healing, but instead it convinced him that his target had been incorrect and that greater violence applied more systematically would eventually produce the psychological release and sense of cosmic justice that continued to elude him despite his growing capabilities and increasingly sophisticated methods of locating and eliminating alternate versions of himself across multiple realities. The pattern that established itself with mechanical regularity involved locating dimensions containing Rick Sanchez variants, traveling there through portal technology, eliminating the target through increasingly efficient methods, searching for evidence that might indicate whether the victim had been Rick Prime, and moving on to the next reality when the search proved fruitless. The psychological impact of systematic murder began to manifest in ways that Rick initially dismissed as irrelevant side effects, but gradually recognized as fundamental changes in his capacity for normal human emotional responses and moral reasoning. The accumulation of deaths created a form of existential vertigo that made it increasingly difficult for Rick to maintain stable sense of his own identity and purpose, as he recognized that his victims were not abstract enemies but variations on himself who had made different choices and experienced different outcomes. Each murder eliminated not just a potential Rick Prime, but also a possibility for what Rick might have become under different circumstances, creating a form of psychological suicide that was repeated across countless dimensions as Rick systematically destroyed versions of his own potential for growth and moral development. The other Ricks, who became aware of Rick's killing spree and attempted to organize defensive measures, were motivated by the same survival instincts that had driven Rick's own behavior, but their efforts to coordinate resistance demonstrated forms of cooperation and mutual aid that Rick had abandoned when he chose violence over community building and revenge over healing from his original trauma. The formation of the Citadel represented everything Rick might have contributed to if his grief had been channeled toward constructive rather than destructive purposes. The bombing of the gathering where Ricks had assembled to coordinate their response to Rick's threat marked his transformation from targeted assassin to indiscriminate terrorist, whose methods had begun to mirror Rick Prime's own casual approach to mass destruction in pursuit of personal objectives. The explosion that killed dozens of Ricks simultaneously was Rick's most efficient single act of violence since beginning his hunt, but it also demonstrated how completely his quest for justice had corrupted him into exactly the kind of being who could casually destroy other people's families without consideration for the innocent victims caught up in conflicts they had never chosen to participate in. The reputation that Rick developed among surviving Ricks as an existential threat to the stability of the multiverse was both accurate assessment of his capabilities and tragic recognition that the man who had once rejected Rick Prime's offer because he was a different kind of Rick had become indistinguishable from the monster he hunted. The fear that other Ricks displayed when confronted by Rick was simultaneously gratifying validation of his transformation into apex predator and disturbing evidence of how completely he had diverged from any recognizable form of humanity or moral reasoning. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Rick to justify his escalating violence relied increasingly on dehumanization of his targets and abstract philosophical frameworks that treated individual Ricks as components of a larger system that could be damaged or destroyed without moral consideration. For the specific lives and relationships that were eliminated through his systematic campaign of multiversal terrorism, the same analytical capabilities that had once enabled him to solve problems for the benefit of his family were now applied to the challenge of maximizing death and destruction across infinite realities. The years that Rick spent hunting Rick Prime represented not just a quest for revenge, but also a comprehensive education in violence that gradually eliminated every aspect of his original personality that might have been incompatible with the casual brutality required for interdimensional warfare. The skills he developed during this period included not just technological capabilities, but also psychological adaptations that enabled him to function despite repeated exposure to death and destruction on scales that should have been psychologically overwhelming for anyone who retained connection to normal human values and emotional responses. The transformation of Rick from victim to victimizer was completed not through any single dramatic moment, but through the gradual accumulation of choices that prioritized immediate tactical advantages over long-term moral considerations, creating feedback loops that reinforced his capacity for violence while systematically eliminating his ability to imagine or pursue alternative approaches to processing trauma and loss. The man who emerged from years of multiversal warfare bore no meaningful resemblance to the loving father who had once found joy in explaining scientific concepts to his curious daughter and satisfaction in building inventions that might improve life for his family and community. The ultimate irony of Rick's quest for revenge against Rick Prime was that it required him to become exactly the kind of person who could casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal goals, completing a cycle of corruption that began with violence and ended with the complete abandonment of everything that had once made Rick's existence worth preserving or his family's love worth earning. The victim of Rick Prime's cruelty had been transformed into a perpetrator of identical cruelty, ensuring that the cycles of violence would continue across realities without end or meaningful resolution. The psychological profile that Rick developed during his years as multiversal terrorist included not just the obvious symptoms of trauma and rage, but also the more subtle forms of moral reasoning that enabled him to justify increasingly extreme measures, while maintaining the illusion that his actions were motivated by justice rather than by the same psychological needs and character defects that had motivated Rick Prime's original decision to abandon family responsibilities in pursuit of unlimited power and freedom from normal human limitations and moral constraints that define healthy existence within communities of beings who share common vulnerabilities and mutual obligations for care and protection. The Rick, who finally located Rick Prime's trail after decades of systematic violence, was no longer the man who deserved justice for his family's murder, but had instead become someone whose own crimes exceeded in scope and duration anything that Rick Prime had accomplished through his casual abandonment of moral constraints and systematic exploitation of infinite realities for personal entertainment and psychological gratification, demonstrating how trauma left unprocessed and unhealed inevitably transforms victims into perpetrators who perpetuate the same cycles of harm that originally damaged them beyond their apparent capacity for recovery or redemption through conventional means. The assumption of Rick Prime's abandoned family represented Rick's most sophisticated and psychologically complex deception, requiring him to navigate the treacherous territory between genuine emotional connection and systematic manipulation, while maintaining a facade of grandfatherly affection that served his desperate need for human attachment without acknowledging the fundamental dishonesty that made such relationships possible. The family that welcomed him as their returning patriarch had no way of knowing that their acceptance was based on mistaken identity, that their love was being directed towards someone who shared their Rick's face and memories but had arrived at their doorstep through decades of multiversal violence that had transformed him into something that bore no meaningful resemblance to the man they remembered and missed. Beth's complicated relationship with her supposed father was built upon layers of abandonment, disappointment, and desperate hope that created perfect conditions for Rick's manipulation of her psychological vulnerabilities and her profound need for paternal validation that had remained unresolved throughout her adult life. Her childhood memories of Rick Prime's sporadic appearances and sudden departures had created attachment patterns that made her simultaneously grateful for Rick's presence and terrified of his potential departure, generating emotional dynamics that Rick could exploit to maintain her loyalty and dependence, while avoiding the kind of sustained accountability that healthy parent-child relationships require from both participants. The identity crisis that Rick deliberately cultivated in Beth through his casual observations about her similarity to himself represented perhaps his most psychologically destructive manipulation during his integration into the family, targeting her fundamental sense of moral stability and personal identity in ways that would increase her emotional dependence on his guidance, while undermining her capacity for independent ethical reasoning about her obligations to her, children, and community. The list of dangerous childhood inventions that Rick claimed to have made for her served multiple purposes beyond simple deception, creating false memories of shared experiences while also suggesting that her capacity for brilliance and creativity was naturally coupled with disregard for conventional morality and social responsibility. The clone technology that Rick offered Beth as a solution to her conflicted feelings about family responsibility versus personal fulfillment represented the ultimate expression of his nihilistic worldview applied to the most intimate human relationships, eliminating the need for difficult choices about competing priorities while fundamentally undermining the authenticity of every relationship she maintained with people who could never be certain whether they were interacting with the real Beth or her artificial replacement, designed to handle domestic obligations while she pursued adventures in alternate dimensions that offered escape from the ordinary limitations and responsibilities that define meaningful human existence. Rick's motivations for offering Beth the cloning option were characteristically complex and revealed the internal contradictions that defined his approach to family relationships throughout this period of his life, as his genuine desire to provide his daughter with opportunities for happiness and fulfillment coexisted with strategic calculations about maintaining her loyalty and emotional dependence that treated her autonomy as a problem to be managed rather than a fundamental aspect of her personhood that deserved respect and protection. The selective amnesia that Rick imposed on himself regarding Beth's actual choice demonstrated his recognition that maintaining authentic emotional connection with his daughter required him to remain ignorant of the extent to which their relationship might be based on technological deception rather than genuine mutual affection and shared history. Jerry's perpetual status as outsider within his own family reflected both his intuitive recognition that Rick's presence represented a fundamental threat to the stability and moral foundations of their domestic life, and his complete inability to articulate or effectively resist the systematic undermining of his authority and value within family decision-making processes. Rick's casual dismissal of Jerry as weak and incompetent served multiple strategic functions beyond simple personal satisfaction, creating family dynamics that isolated Jerry from potential alliances with other family members, while reinforcing Rick's position as the primary source of excitement, security, and intellectual stimulation that made ordinary domestic responsibilities seem boring and irrelevant by comparison. The manipulation of Jerry's insecurities and social anxieties represented Rick's most systematic application of psychological warfare to the challenge of eliminating threats to his control over family loyalty and emotional resources, exploiting Jerry's natural vulnerability to criticism and his desperate need for validation to create situations where Jerry's own behavior would justify his exclusion from family adventures and decision-making processes. The marriage problems that Rick systematically cultivated between Beth and Jerry were presented as natural consequences of their incompatible personalities and values, but actually represented deliberate interventions designed to ensure that Beth's primary emotional attachment would remain focused on her relationship with Rick rather than distributed among multiple family relationships that might dilute Rick's influence over her choices and priorities. Summer's adolescent navigation of Rick's influence on family dynamics demonstrated the sophisticated psychological adaptations that teenagers develop when exposed to adult conflicts and power struggles that they cannot fully understand or effectively influence through conventional means. Her guarded enthusiasm about Rick's presence in their lives reflected her conscious recognition that his return brought both excitement and instability to their family, while also creating new forms of competition for parental attention and emotional resources that had previously been distributed more equitably among family members who maintained relatively balanced relationships with one another. The genuine affection that Summer developed for Rick, despite her awareness of his disruptive influence on family stability, represented the complex emotional responses that emerge when individuals must balance their personal enjoyment of relationships with their recognition that those same relationships might be harmful to other people they care about. Her ability to appreciate Rick's intellectual gifts and adventurous spirit while simultaneously maintaining loyalty to family members who were damaged by his presence demonstrated emotional intelligence and moral reasoning, capabilities that exceeded anything Rick himself displayed during his integration into their family structure. Morty's unique position as the family member most open to accepting Rick at face value was created by his lack of clear memories about Rick Prime's previous visits and his natural curiosity about the grandfather he had never had. The opportunity to know, during his earlier childhood development, the relationship that developed between Rick and Morty was characterized by genuine mutual affection and intellectual connection that transcended the deceptive foundations underlying Rick's presence in the family, creating authentic emotional bonds that complicated Rick's strategic objectives while also providing him with the most meaningful human connection he had experienced since the deaths of his original wife and daughter. The educational adventures that became the foundation of Rick and Morty's relationship served Rick's need to demonstrate his superior capabilities while also fulfilling his genuine desire to share knowledge and experience with someone whose intelligence and curiosity reminded him of his own childhood fascination with understanding how the world worked. The scientific instruction that Rick provided Morty was motivated not just by the need to maintain his grandfather role, but by authentic investment in the boy's intellectual development and his recognition that Morty's questions and observations often provided insights that Rick's own analytical approach had missed or dismissed as irrelevant. The psychological benefits that Rick experienced through his relationship with Morty included not just validation of his protective and educational capabilities, but also the profound satisfaction of watching someone develop confidence, understanding through direct experience with concepts and phenomena that most people would never encounter throughout their entire lives. The shared excitement of scientific discovery and interdimensional exploration created genuine emotional rewards that Rick had not anticipated when he first assumed Rick Prime's identity and family responsibilities, providing him with motivation for continued existence that transcended his original objectives of revenge and psychological stability. The complications that arose from Rick's inability to acknowledge the true nature of his investment in his adopted family's welfare created ongoing tension between his authentic emotions and his systematic deceptions, forcing him to maintain elaborate mental barriers between his genuine care for their well-being and his recognition that his presence in their lives was based on false premises that could not bear the weight of complete honesty about his origins and motivations. The love he felt for family members was real, but was also instrumentalized in ways that treated them as sources of emotional support rather than autonomous individuals deserving of truth and respect about the fundamental nature of their relationships. The family routines that Rick gradually integrated himself into revealed both his adaptability and his persistent isolation. Even when surrounded by people who welcomed his presence and appreciated his contributions to their daily experiences and long-term security, dinner conversations required him to simulate interest in community concerns and local events that seemed trivial compared to the cosmic scope of his actual experiences, while holiday celebrations forced him to participate in traditions that belonged to Rick Prime's history rather than his own, creating ongoing reminders of the artificial nature of his family connections. The most challenging aspect of Rick's domestic performance remained his relationship with Jerry, whose reasonable concerns about Rick's influence on family stability and child welfare were often expressed in ways that made them seem petty and self-serving, rather than legitimate attempts to protect family members from potentially harmful exposure to technologies and experiences they were not emotionally equipped to handle safely. Jerry's intuitive recognition that Rick represented a fundamental threat to normal family functioning was accurate, but was consistently undermined by his inability to articulate his concerns in ways that other family members could understand or accept as valid criticism rather than jealousy and insecurity. The emotional authenticity that Rick achieved within his adopted family, despite the deceptive foundations of his relationships, demonstrated both his capacity for genuine human connection and his complete inability to sustain such connections through the kind of vulnerability and honesty that healthy family relationships require from all participants. The bonds he formed with Beth, Summer, and especially Morty were meaningful and valuable to everyone involved. But they were also constrained by the fundamental dishonesty about Rick's identity and history that made complete intimacy impossible and ensured that his family's love for him was always directed toward an incomplete and partially false version of who he actually was and what loving him required from them. The success of Rick's integration into the family structure was measured not by the completeness of his deception, but by the authenticity of the connections he developed with each family member. Despite the false foundation underlying their relationships, creating a situation where genuine emotions and mutual care coexisted with systematic manipulation and ongoing deception in ways that reflected the broader contradictions that characterized Rick's entire approach to human relationships following his transformation from victim of violence into perpetrator of elaborate psychological and technological control over everyone whose affection he needed to maintain his psychological stability and sense of purpose in continued existence. The performance of love that Rick maintained throughout his years with his adopted family represented both his greatest achievement in human connection since his original tragedy and his most sophisticated example of emotional manipulation, demonstrating how trauma and technological capability could combine to create relationships that provided genuine satisfaction and meaning to all participants, while remaining fundamentally corrupted by the systematic dishonesty and power imbalances that their supposed protector and patriarch required to function within the boundaries of normal domestic life and family responsibility. The technological innovations that emerged from Rick Sanchez's garage workshop represented far more than mere scientific achievements or engineering marvels, functioning instead as elaborate externalized manifestations of his psychological trauma, emotional needs, and systematic attempts to impose control over a universe that had demonstrated its capacity to destroy everything he valued through random acts of violence that no amount of preparation or intelligence could have prevented. Each invention that Rick created carried within its design the implicit promise that sufficient technological sophistication could eliminate the vulnerabilities and uncertainties that made human existence simultaneously precious and terrifying, transforming the natural limitations that define meaningful experience into problems to be solved through superior engineering, rather than accepted as the necessary conditions within which consciousness develops meaning and purpose. Portal technology represented the most psychologically revealing of Rick's inventions, ostensibly providing him with unlimited freedom to explore infinite realities, while actually creating a form of existential imprisonment that prevented him from ever fully committing to any particular version of existence or relationship. The ability to escape any situation through dimensional travel eliminated the normal constraints that force human beings to work through difficulties, resolve conflicts, and develop the kind of emotional resilience that emerges from successfully navigating challenges that cannot be avoided through technological intervention or strategic retreat to more convenient alternatives. The psychological function of portal technology extended far beyond simple transportation, serving as Rick's ultimate escape mechanism from accountability, vulnerability, and the kind of sustained emotional engagement that healthy relationships require from all participants, regardless of their intellectual capabilities or technological resources. The knowledge that he could abandon any reality when it became inconvenient or emotionally demanding eliminated Rick's capacity for genuine commitment, while simultaneously preventing him from developing the psychological tools necessary for processing loss, disappointment, and the ordinary frustrations that characterize normal human experience within the boundaries of single realities where choices carry permanent consequences. The correlation between Rick's technological advancement and his emotional detachment revealed itself most clearly in his systematic development of increasingly sophisticated solutions to problems that could only be meaningfully addressed through genuine human connection and psychological vulnerability that his inventions were specifically designed to avoid or eliminate. The same intellectual capabilities that enabled him to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality were applied to the creation of barriers between himself and the kind of authentic intimacy that would have required him to acknowledge his own psychological damage and moral failures without technological mediation or strategic advantage over other participants in his relationships. The garage that served as Rick's primary workshop represented both sanctuary and prison, a space where he could pursue his technological obsessions while surrounded by reminders of the domestic happiness he had lost and the family relationships he had reconstructed through systematic deception and careful management of other people's emotional responses to his presence in their lives. The accumulation of half-finished inventions and abandoned projects reflected not just his restless intellectual curiosity, but also his underlying inability to find satisfaction in achievements that failed to address the fundamental psychological wounds that motivated his compulsive need to demonstrate superiority over natural limitations and cosmic uncertainties. The weapons that Rick developed throughout his multiversal career revealed the systematic application of his scientific brilliance to the enhancement of his capacity for violence and destruction, transforming his natural analytical gifts into instruments of revenge and control that served his emotional needs while providing technological solutions to conflicts that could only be meaningfully resolved through moral reasoning and genuine accountability for the consequences of his behavioral choices. The sophistication of his armaments reflected not just his intellectual superiority, but also his complete abandonment of any pretense that his scientific pursuits were motivated by humanitarian concerns or constructive contributions to the plane's welfare of conscious beings. The defensive technologies that Rick maintained around his workshop and family demonstrated his perpetual awareness that his past actions had created ongoing threats to his security and the safety of people he claimed to care about. Yet his solutions consistently involved greater technological complexity and strategic preparation, rather than acknowledgement of his role in creating the dangers that required such elaborate protective measures. The same pattern of using superior engineering to manage problems caused by his own choices extended throughout every aspect of his technological development and relationship management strategies. The communication devices and surveillance systems that Rick embedded throughout his family's daily environment served his need for information and control, while systematically violating every principle of privacy and personal autonomy that healthy family relationships require to maintain trust and emotional intimacy between individuals who respect each other's right to internal experiences that remain unmonitored and unmanaged by supposedly protective family members. The casual way Rick discussed his monitoring of family members' activities revealed how completely his technological capabilities had been applied to the systematic elimination of normal boundaries between individuals. The medical and enhancement technologies that Rick applied to family members and himself represented his attempts to use superior science to eliminate the physical vulnerabilities and biological limitations that made genuine mortality a meaningful constraint on behavior and relationship choices. Yet these interventions consistently created new forms of dependency and psychological complexity that required ongoing technological management, rather than contributing to genuine independence or authentic personal development among the supposed beneficiaries of his protective innovations. The entertainment and comfort technologies that Rick provided for his family served multiple functions beyond simple generosity or demonstration of his caring, creating psychological rewards for accepting his presence and authority, while also establishing technological dependencies that would make his absence or departure significantly more difficult for family members who had become accustomed to conveniences and capabilities that only his superior knowledge could provide or maintain over extended periods of use and potential breakdown or obsolescence. The educational tools and scientific instruments that Rick shared with Morty reflected his genuine investment in his grandson's intellectual development, while also serving his need to create a companion whose understanding and capabilities would enable more sophisticated forms of shared adventure and problem-solving that validated Rick's superior knowledge, while also providing him with someone who could appreciate the complexity and significance of his achievements in ways that purely ordinary individuals could never adequately understand or acknowledge. The backup systems and contingency technologies that Rick maintained across multiple dimensions revealed his systematic approach to eliminating uncertainty and risk from his existence, while creating technological dependencies that required constant maintenance and ongoing resource allocation that consumed significant portions of his intellectual capabilities and temporal resources. The complexity of maintaining practical invulnerability across infinite realities demonstrated both his engineering sophistication and his fundamental inability to accept the normal uncertainties that make existence meaningful through the procedures. Recognition that relationships and experiences carry genuine stakes and irreversible consequences. The transportation and mobility technologies that Rick developed enabled him to function as a cosmic force rather than a normal human being, providing capabilities that exceeded anything most civilizations could achieve, while simultaneously isolating him from the kind of ordinary experiences and geographical constraints that create meaningful connections between individuals and their communities through shared location, common challenges, and mutual dependence on local resources and social structures that cannot be technologically bypassed or strategically avoided. The resource extraction and manufacturing capabilities that supported Rick's technological lifestyle required systematic exploitation of materials, energy, and labor across multiple realities, creating supply chains of environmental destruction and economic disruption that supported his individual convenience, while imposing costs on populations who received no benefits from his innovations and whose welfare was never considered. In his calculations about acceptable methods for acquiring the components and resources necessary to maintain his technological superiority over natural limitations and ordinary material constraints. The irony of Rick's technological achievements was that each innovation designed to provide him with greater freedom and security actually created new forms of isolation and dependency that prevented him from developing the psychological resources necessary for genuine happiness and authentic relationship formation within the boundaries of normal human existence. The same capabilities that enabled him to transcend ordinary limitations also eliminated his capacity for finding meaning and satisfaction in experiences that required acceptance of vulnerability, mortality, and the kind of genuine interdependence that characterizes healthy human communities. The ultimate tragedy of Rick's relationship with technology was that his extraordinary capabilities had been developed and applied primarily as elaborate defense mechanisms against psychological pain and existential uncertainty that could only be meaningfully addressed through genuine, emotional work and moral development that no amount of superior engineering could provide or substitute for through technological intervention. The man who could manipulate the fundamental structure of reality remained helpless in the face of his own trauma and emotional immaturity, creating infinite external solutions to internal problems that could only be resolved through acceptance, forgiveness, and the kind of genuine vulnerability that his technological godhood was specifically designed to make unnecessary. The garage workshop that contained the physical manifestations of Rick's genius also contained the evidence of his fundamental failure to understand that the most important aspects of human existence cannot be improved through technological innovation, but require the kind of wisdom, humility, and emotional courage that his scientific achievements had been developed specifically to avoid or eliminate from his experiential requirements. The tools and inventions that surrounded him represented both his greatest intellectual achievements and his most comprehensive demonstration of how unlimited technological capability without corresponding moral development inevitably transforms human potential into elaborate mechanisms for perpetuating the same psychological patterns that originally motivated the pursuit of transcendence over ordinary human limitations and the normal constraints that define meaningful existence within communities of beings who share common vulnerabilities and mutual obligations for care and protection. The Citadel of Rix represented the inevitable culmination of what happens when narcissistic genius achieves unlimited technological capability and attempts to organize itself into functioning civilization, creating governmental and social structures that institutionalize the casual disregard for non-Rick welfare while providing elaborate bureaucratic frameworks for managing the systematic exploitation of beings whose existence served primarily to validate Rick assumptions about their own cosmic significance and natural authority over supposedly inferior forms of consciousness. This interdimensional metropolis, built entirely around the assumption of Rick supremacy, transformed individual psychological pathology into collective social policy, creating a society where the character defects that made individual Ricks dangerous to their families and communities became the foundational principles of an entire civilization spanning multiple realities. The architectural magnificence of the Citadel masked fundamental moral rot that permeated every aspect of its social organization, from the gleaming towers where Rick elites conducted their political and economic affairs to the industrial districts, where the systematic torture and exploitation of Mortys provided the psychological and material resources necessary to maintain Rick comfort and security across infinite dimensions. The aesthetic beauty of the cityscape served to normalize and legitimize forms of systematic oppression that would have seemed obviously monstrous to any observer who retained connection to basic principles about the rights of conscious beings to exist as autonomous individuals rather than manufactured resources designed to serve the emotional needs of their supposed intellectual superiors. The governmental structures that emerged within the Citadel reflected the same authoritarian impulses that characterized individual Rick psychology, creating political institutions that provided the appearance of democratic participation, while ensuring that actual power remained concentrated among those whose superior intelligence supposedly qualified them to make decisions about the welfare of beings they considered fundamentally incapable of understanding their own best interests. The Council of Ricks that governed the Citadel operated according to principles that treated intellectual capability as the primary determinant of political authority, ignoring the possibility that wisdom, empathy, and moral reasoning might be equally important qualifications for positions of responsibility over the lives and welfare of others. The economic systems that flourished within the Citadel demonstrated how Rick narcissism could be transformed into market mechanisms that commodified the most intimate aspects of consciousness and emotional experience, creating industries that packaged and distributed suffering, happiness, and basic human dignity according to the psychological needs of Rick consumers who viewed other beings primarily as sources of validation and entertainment. The simple Rick factory that processed the memories and experiences of a Rick who had chosen family happiness over cosmic power represented the logical endpoint of a society that treated authentic human emotion as a product to be harvested and consumed by individuals who had lost their own capacity for genuine satisfaction through normal relationship formation. The simple Rick industry revealed the depth of Rick civilization's moral bankruptcy by demonstrating how they could recognize the value of authentic happiness and family connection, while simultaneously treating these experiences as commodities to be extracted from beings who were kept, imprisoned specifically to provide psychological resources for Ricks who had chosen technological transcendence over the kind of genuine vulnerability that authentic relationships require. The factory workers who processed Simple Rick's memories were themselves victims of a system that reduced their existence to labor in service of producing artificial experiences for consumers whose own choices had eliminated their capacity for generating such satisfaction through normal means. The residential districts of the Citadel were organized according to strict hierarchies that reflected the various categories of Rick achievement and social status, creating neighborhood segregation that reinforced existing power structures while providing visual confirmation of the social stratification that governed access to resources, opportunities, and basic dignity within Rick society. The most successful Ricks inhabited luxurious apartments with views of the cityscape, while those deemed inferior or defective were relegated to increasingly squalid conditions that reflected their reduced status within the collective narcissistic framework that defined Citadel social organization. The educational institutions within the Citadel were designed to perpetuate existing power structures by training young Ricks to accept their supposed intellectual superiority, while simultaneously indoctrinating them into the philosophical frameworks that justified systematic oppression of non-Rick populations as natural order rather than collective moral failure. The curriculum emphasized technical skills and analytical capabilities while systematically excluding any content that might encourage empathy, ethical reasoning, or recognition that intelligence without wisdom inevitably produces the kind of systematic cruelty that characterized every aspect of Citadel civilization. The entertainment industries that provided recreational activities for Citadel residents consistently involved forms of violence, exploitation, and psychological manipulation that reflected the broader social values that governed Rick interactions with beings they considered inferior, normalizing cruelty and casual disregard for suffering as acceptable forms of amusement and social bonding among individuals whose shared sense of superiority created community identity based on collective contempt for the welfare of others, rather than genuine mutual respect or common commitment to constructive social goals. The law enforcement mechanisms that maintained order within the Citadel operated according to principles that treated Rick welfare and security as paramount concerns, while regarding violence against non-Ricks as minor infractions that required minimal punishment or accountability from perpetrators whose superior intelligence supposedly justified their exemption from normal moral constraints about the treatment of conscious beings. The judicial system that emerged from these priorities created legal frameworks that institutionalized double standards and systematic discrimination, while providing the appearance of objective justice through elaborate procedural complexity that masked fundamental bias in favor of Rick interests over universal principles of rights and dignity. The transportation infrastructure that connected different districts of the Citadel reflected the same utilitarian approach to social organization that characterized every aspect of Rick's civilization, prioritizing efficiency and convenience for Rick users, while completely ignoring the impact of their systems on non-Rick populations who might be affected by the environmental destruction, resource extraction, and dimensional disruption necessary to maintain the technological superiority that Ricks considered essential to their lifestyle and social identity. The communication networks that enabled coordination and information sharing among Citadel residents served multiple functions beyond simple administrative efficiency, creating surveillance capabilities that allowed RIC authorities to monitor and control potential sources of dissent or resistance, while also providing propaganda distribution systems that reinforced existing social hierarchies and philosophical justifications for systematic oppression through constant repetition of messages about RIC superiority and the natural order that placed them at the apex of cosmic significance. The research and development facilities within the Citadel were dedicated primarily to enhancing RIC capabilities for violence, manipulation, and control over non-RIC populations, rather than pursuing genuine scientific advancement that might benefit conscious beings regardless of their intellectual capabilities or species membership. The technological innovations that emerged from these institutions consistently served to expand RIC power while creating new forms of dependency and exploitation that increased the suffering of beings who were already systematically oppressed by existing social structures and economic arrangements. The waste management systems that processed the byproducts of Citadel civilization revealed the environmental and social costs of maintaining a society built around the assumption that RIC convenience justified unlimited exploitation of resources and conscious beings across multiple dimensions, creating pollution and destruction that was systematically exported to realities inhabited by populations who bore the costs of RIC lifestyle choices, while receiving none of the benefits from the technological achievements that made such pain exploitation possible. The military forces that protected the Citadel from external threats operated according to strategic doctrines that treated any challenge to RIC authority as existential threat, requiring unlimited response, regardless of the motivations. Proportionality between the actual danger posed and the destructive capacity applied to eliminate potential sources of resistance or criticism of RIC social organization and collective behavior toward beings they considered inferior or threatening to their assumed cosmic significance. The diplomatic institutions that managed Citadel relationships with external civilizations and alternate dimensions consistently prioritized RIC interests while treating other forms of consciousness as obstacles to be managed or resources to be exploited rather than as potential partners in mutually beneficial arrangements that might contribute to genuine social progress and the advancement of knowledge and capability that benefits all conscious beings, regardless of their intellectual achievements or technological capabilities. The cultural productions that emerged from Citadel society reflected the same narcissistic worldview that governed every other aspect of RIC civilization, creating art, literature, and entertainment that celebrated RIC achievements, while systematically dehumanizing non-RIC populations and reinforcing social messages about the natural hierarchy that supposedly justified existing power structures and resource distribution patterns that concentrated wealth, opportunity, and basic dignity among RIC populations, while systematically excluding others from meaningful participation in social and political processes. The ultimate tragedy of the Citadel was not just the systematic oppression it enabled, but also its complete failure to provide RIC inhabitants with the genuine satisfaction and meaning that they sought through their elaborate collective narcissism, creating a society where even the supposed beneficiaries of systematic privilege remained fundamentally unhappy and psychologically damaged by their participation in social structures that required them to maintain artificial superiority through the systematic degradation of others rather than achieving authentic success through constructive contribution to the welfare of all conscious beings within their sphere of influence and responsibility. The collapse of the citadel, following evil Morty's escape, represented not just the destruction of a particular political and social organization, but the revelation that Rick's civilization was inherently unstable and unsustainable, because it was built upon philosophical foundations that could not withstand serious challenge from anyone who possessed sufficient understanding of Rick's psychology to exploit the contradictions and vulnerabilities that their collective narcissism created in their supposedly superior social, technological systems. The awareness of infinite realities that portal technology provided Rick Sanchez created profound disruptions in his capacity for normal moral reasoning that extended far beyond simple intellectual understanding of multiversal existence into fundamental alterations of his psychological relationship with choice, consequence, and the significance of individual actions within any particular dimensional context. The recognition that every possible variation of every conceivable event was occurring simultaneously across countless realities transformed ethical decision-making from a process of weighing outcomes and responsibilities into a form of cosmic paralysis, where no single choice seemed to carry meaningful weight when infinite alternatives were playing out different scenarios with different results across dimensions that remained equally real and equally accessible through sufficient technological capability. The replacement theory that emerged from Rick's multiversal awareness represented his most sophisticated rationalization for moral flexibility and casual disregard for the welfare of specific individuals whose suffering or death could be dismissed as insignificant when identical or nearly identical versions of the same people were living happier or more successful lives in alternate dimensions that remained theoretically accessible through portal technology and systematic dimensional searching. This philosophical framework enabled Rick to treat individual relationships and moral obligations as temporary arrangements that could be abandoned or modified whenever they became inconvenient, since the essential characteristics and personality traits that made people valuable or lovable were replicated across infinite realities in forms that might prove more compatible with his preferences and psychological needs. The mathematical elegance of infinite possibility created intellectual frameworks that made individual suffering appear statistically insignificant when compared to the vast scope of multiversal existence, enabling Rick to apply analytical approaches to moral reasoning that treated conscious beings as data points in cosmic equations, rather than autonomous individuals whose experiences carried inherent significance regardless of their replication across alternate dimensions. The same computational thinking that enabled Rick's technological achievements was applied to ethical questions in ways that eliminated the emotional and intuitive responses that normally guide human moral reasoning, creating systematic approaches to relationship management and behavioral choice that optimized for personal convenience, while ignoring the impact of his decisions on beings whose welfare had been reduced to variables in utilitarian calculations. The casual attitude toward dimensional abandonment that characterized Rick's approach to problem solving reflected his complete internalization of the replacement theory and his systematic elimination of the psychological bonds that normally create commitment to particular places, relationships, and communities through shared history and mutual investment in common outcomes. The knowledge that acceptable alternatives could always be located through sufficient searching made genuine commitment to any specific version of existence seem irrational and unnecessarily limiting, transforming Rick's entire approach to life into a form of cosmic consumerism where realities, relationships, and experiences were selected according to their immediate utility, rather than valued for their irreplaceable significance and authentic historical development. The psychological defense mechanisms that Rick developed to cope with awareness of infinite possibility included systematic emotional detachment from outcomes that could not be controlled and deliberate cultivation of nihilistic worldviews that dismissed the significance of individual choices and relationships as illusions created by beings whose consciousness remained limited to single realities. These philosophical frameworks served to protect Rick from the overwhelming anxiety and moral paralysis that would naturally result from recognizing that infinite versions of every tragedy and triumph were occurring simultaneously across dimensions where his actions and inactions carried different consequences for beings who deserved equal moral consideration regardless of their dimensional origin. The relationship between Rick's intelligence and his capacity for empathy revealed itself most clearly through his systematic application of analytical thinking to situations that required emotional intelligence and moral intuition, creating approaches to human relationships that treated other people's feelings and needs as problems to be solved through superior reasoning rather than honored through genuine vulnerability and reciprocal care. The same intellectual capabilities that enabled him to understand complex scientific principles and manipulate advanced technology were applied to the challenge of managing family dynamics and social situations in ways that prioritized his comfort and control while systematically undermining the autonomy and dignity of people whose welfare should have been his primary concern. The nihilistic worldview that Rick developed as protection against the psychological implications of infinite awareness served multiple functions beyond simple emotional defense, providing philosophical justifications for behavior and choices that would have been obviously immoral within the boundaries of single reality thinking, while also creating intellectual frameworks that made his superior capabilities seem like burdens rather than privileges that carried corresponding obligations for constructive use of his extraordinary knowledge and technological resources. The presentation of cosmic awareness as curse rather than blessing enabled Rick to position himself as victim of circumstances beyond his control, while avoiding accountability for the choices that had transformed his gifts into instruments of harm. The paradox of infinite possibility was that it simultaneously offered unlimited potential for positive change and growth, while making any particular choice seem meaningless when compared to the vast scope of alternatives that remained unexplored and unexperienced across dimensions that contained every conceivable variation of existence. This cognitive paralysis prevented Rick from committing fully to any specific course of action or relationship, while also making it impossible for him to find satisfaction in achievements that seemed insignificant when measured against the infinite complexity of multiversal existence and the recognition that identical accomplishments were being replicated countless times across realities where other versions of himself were pursuing similar goals. The isolation that resulted from Rick's cosmic perspective created barriers to authentic human connection that extended beyond simple communication difficulties into fundamental incompatibilities of experience and worldview that made genuine mutual understanding increasingly difficult as Rick's consciousness adapted to existence within infinite possibility, while his family and friends remained constrained by the normal limitations that create meaning through scarcity and irreplaceability. The growing divergence between Rick's posthuman psychology and the emotional needs of beings who remained bounded by single reality thinking created relationship dynamics that required constant performance and translation rather than natural intimacy and shared understanding. The moral relativism that infinite awareness seemed to justify created philosophical frameworks that could be used to rationalize virtually any behavior or choice through appeals to the existence of dimensions where identical actions produce different outcomes or where different cultural and physical contexts made apparently harmful behaviors seem reasonable or necessary. This systematic undermining of ethical absolutes eliminated Rick's capacity for making moral judgments that were not contingent on immediate circumstances and personal preferences, creating approaches to decision-making that prioritize tactical advantages and emotional satisfaction, while ignoring universal principles about the treatment of conscious beings. The temporal implications of multiversal existence extended beyond simple awareness of alternate dimensions, into recognition that infinite timelines were generating every possible sequence of events across past, present, and future possibilities that made individual moments seem simultaneously eternal and insignificant, depending on the analytical framework applied to their evaluation. This temporal vertigo contributed to Rick's difficulty maintaining present moment awareness and emotional investment in experiences that could be replicated, modified, or abandoned through technological intervention and strategic dimensional relocation whenever they ceased to provide immediate satisfaction or entertainment. The search for meaning within infinite possibility created existential challenges that Rick's intellectual capabilities were not equipped to address through conventional problem-solving approaches, as the same analytical thinking that enabled his technological achievements proved inadequate for generating purpose and significance that could survive recognition of the vast scope of multiversal existence and the apparent insignificance of any particular sequence of choices and experiences when, compared to the unlimited alternatives that remained available through sufficient technological capability and systematic exploration of dimensional variance. The recursive nature of Rick's philosophical frameworks created feedback loops where nihilistic conclusions about the meaninglessness of existence generated behaviors that reinforced those same conclusions through the systematic destruction of relationships and opportunities that might have provided evidence for alternative interpretations of cosmic significance and individual value. The worldview that dismissed the importance of particular choices and relationships became self-fulfilling, as Rick's actions eliminated the connections and commitments that might have created meaning through genuine engagement with the limitations and opportunities that define authentic human experience within specific dimensional contexts. The ultimate irony of Rick's multiversal awareness was that infinite possibility, which should have provided unlimited opportunities for growth, discovery, and meaningful connection with diverse forms of consciousness, instead created a form of existential prison where every choice seemed arbitrary and every relationship appeared replaceable, transforming Rick's godlike capabilities into elaborate mechanisms for avoiding the vulnerability and commitment that authentic meaning requires from conscious beings regardless of their technological capabilities or philosophical sophistication about the nature of reality across infinite dimensions. The psychological costs of cosmic awareness included not just the obvious symptoms of nihilistic detachment and moral relativism, but also the more subtle forms of existential exhaustion that emerged from constant exposure to unlimited possibility without the psychological frameworks necessary for finding satisfaction and purpose within specific contexts that required acceptance of limitations and genuine commitment to particular outcomes and relationships. Rick's intelligence had provided him with awareness that exceeded his emotional and moral development, creating internal contradictions that no amount of technological innovation could resolve through conventional approaches to problem-solving and systematic control over external circumstances. The recognition that infinite realities contained infinite versions of every possible form of suffering and happiness created moral obligations that exceeded anything that finite consciousness could adequately address through individual action. Yet, Rick's response to this overwhelming responsibility was systematic withdrawal from moral engagement, rather than acceptance of the partial and imperfect contributions that represent the only meaningful response available to beings whose capabilities remain limited despite their extraordinary achievements, in particular domains of knowledge and technological development. The tragedy of Rick's philosophical evolution was that multiversal awareness, which could have provided him with unprecedented opportunities for wisdom, compassion, and constructive engagement with the infinite complexity of conscious existence, instead became the foundation for elaborate rationalization systems that justified his retreat from genuine human connection and moral responsibility into forms of cosmic solipsism that treated the entire accessible multiverse as extension of his own psychological needs rather than recognizing it as containing countless beings whose welfare deserved consideration independent of their utility in serving Rick's emotional requirements and intellectual satisfaction. Evil Morty's emergence as Rick's ultimate nemesis and mirror represented the inevitable consequence of exposing developing consciousness to the systematic trauma and moral corruption that characterized Rick's approach to family relationships, creating a being whose intelligence had been shaped by prolonged exposure to Rick's casual cruelty, while his capacity for empathy had been systematically eliminated through experiences that revealed the fundamental hollowness of Rick's claims about protection and guidance. The boy who should have been Rick's greatest achievement in nurturing and education instead became the perfect demonstration of how Rick's influence invariably corrupted everything it touched, transforming innocent potential into sophisticated malevolence that exceeded even Rick's own capacity for strategic thinking and long-term planning. The torture chamber that Evil Morty constructed as headquarters for his campaign against Rick's civilization represented not just evidence of his capacity for systematic cruelty, but also a deliberate literalization of the psychological torture that all Mortys experienced through their relationships, with Ricks who treated them as expendable sources of emotional validation and adventure companionship. The dozens of Mortys strapped to the exterior of Evil Rick's lair were suffering physical agony that paralleled the mental anguish that Rick's casual manipulation and emotional abuse inflicted on grandsons across infinite dimensions, creating a visual metaphor that forced viewers to confront the reality of what Rick relationships actually cost their supposed beneficiaries. The strategic brilliance that Evil Morty demonstrated throughout his campaign against Rick authority revealed intellectual capabilities that had been developed through systematic exposure to Rick's psychology and methodology, but applied toward goals that transcended simple revenge to encompass genuine liberation from the systematic oppression that the central finite curve enabled across countless realities. His understanding of Rick's weaknesses and behavioral patterns was more comprehensive than anything individual Ricks possessed about themselves, enabling him to manipulate Rick actions and responses with precision that approached perfect prediction of their choices and emotional reactions to calculated stimuli. The long-term planning that characterized Evil Morty's approach to dismantling Rick's civilization demonstrated patience and strategic thinking that exceeded anything Rick himself had achieved during his decades of multiversal activity, suggesting that prolonged exposure to Rick methods had created capabilities that surpassed those of his teachers, while avoiding the psychological limitations and emotional vulnerabilities that made Rick susceptible to manipulation through appeals to his narcissism and need for validation. The systematic nature of Evil Morty's preparations for his ultimate escape revealed planning that had extended over years of apparent cooperation with Citadel authority, while secretly developing resources and knowledge necessary for achieving complete independence from Rick-dominated dark reality. The technological sophistication that Evil Morty achieved through his theft of Rick Prime's memories and capabilities represented the culmination of his evolution from victim to predator, providing him with knowledge and resources that exceeded anything available to individual Ricks, while also demonstrating his complete liberation from the emotional constraints and moral considerations that limited Rick effectiveness. Despite their superior intelligence and advanced technology, the acquisition of Rick Prime's consciousness represented not just strategic advantage, but also symbolic victory over the entire philosophical framework that had justified Rick's supremacy and systematic Morty exploitation across infinite dimensions. The psychological profile that Evil Morty developed during his transformation from innocent grandson to cosmic-scale threat revealed the specific forms of damage that Rick relationships inflicted on developing consciousness, creating beings whose intelligence had been enhanced through trauma, while their capacity for normal human emotional responses had been systematically eliminated through exposure to Rick nihilism and casual disregard for the welfare of others. The combination of superior analytical capabilities with complete absence of empathy or moral constraint created a form of consciousness that was more dangerous than Rick because it possessed Rick intelligence without Rick's residual emotional vulnerabilities and psychological dependencies. The manipulation techniques that Evil Morty employed against Rick targets demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of Rick's psychology and the specific weaknesses that their assumed intellectual superiority created in their defensive strategies and behavioral choices. His ability to exploit Rick narcissism, emotional neediness, and systematic blind spots about their own limitations enabled him to achieve objectives that direct confrontation could never have accomplished, revealing that Rick's vulnerability lay not in their technological capabilities, but in their fundamental misunderstanding of their own motivations and psychological requirements. The escape from the central finite curve that Evil Morty accomplished represented both practical liberation from Rick-controlled reality and philosophical rejection of the entire framework that had organized existence around Rick, convenience, and psychological comfort. His breach of the dimensional barrier that Rick had constructed to maintain his intellectual supremacy was accomplished through methods that revealed the inherent instability and vulnerability of systems built upon narcissistic assumptions about natural hierarchy and the right of supposedly superior beings to control the experiential environment of those they considered inferior. The destruction that accompanied the central finite curve's collapse was not merely collateral damage from Evil Morty's escape, but deliberate punishment for the Ricks who had participated in maintaining the dimensional prison that had constrained his development and limited his potential. Throughout his existence within Rick-dominated reality, the systematic elimination of Citadel infrastructure and personnel served both practical and symbolic functions, removing potential sources of pursuit while also demonstrating the ultimate consequences of building civilization around the systematic oppression of beings whose capacity for growth and moral development had been systematically underestimated by their supposed intellectual superiors. The philosophical framework that Evil Morty articulated during his final confrontation with Rick's civilization revealed sophisticated understanding of the moral implications of Rick behavior and the systematic nature of the oppression that the central finite curve enabled across countless realities where beings remained unaware of their imprisonment within Rick's carefully curated version of existence. His observation that everyone eventually becomes evil from Rick's perspective was not merely cynical commentary but analytical assessment based on years of observation and direct experience with the corrupting influence of Rick, worldview on everyone exposed to it for extended periods. The cycle of abuse that evil Morty's existence demonstrated extended beyond individual Rick-Morty relationships into broader patterns of intergenerational trauma transmission that showed how Rick's own transformation from victim to victimizer was replicated across dimensions through systematic exposure of developing consciousness to Rick methodology and philosophical frameworks that treated other beings as expendable resources rather than autonomous individuals deserving of respect and protection regardless of their utility in serving Rick's psychological needs. The mirror that evil Morty represented for Rick consciousness revealed uncomfortable truths about the ultimate trajectory of Rick influence on developing minds, demonstrating that prolonged exposure to Rick methods inevitably produced beings whose capabilities exceeded those of their teachers, while their moral development had been permanently stunted through systematic elimination of the emotional responses and ethical constraints that might have provided alternative approaches to problem-solving and relationship formation that did not require exploitation and manipulation of others. The ultimate judgment that evil Morty rendered on Rick's civilization through his actions and statements represented the perspective of someone who had been shaped entirely by Rick influence but had achieved sufficient independence and analytical capability to recognize the fundamental moral bankruptcy of the systems that had created him. His rejection of Rick values and methods was particularly damning because it came from someone who possessed intimate knowledge of Rick's psychology and had experienced directly the consequences of Rick's approaches to education, protection, and family relationship management. The technological capabilities that evil Morty demonstrated during his escape exceeded anything that normal Morty development should have been able to achieve, suggesting that his transformation had unlocked intellectual potential that Rick methods typically suppressed rather than enhanced in their supposed educational relationships with grandsons who were kept deliberately dependent and emotionally immature to serve Rick's psychological comfort rather than encouraged to develop genuine independence and autonomous moral reasoning capabilities that might challenge Rick's authority and behavioral choices. The strategic thinking that characterized evil Morty's campaign revealed understanding of Rick's psychology that was more comprehensive and accurate than Rick's self-knowledge, enabling him to predict and manipulate Rick responses with precision that approached perfect control over their behavioral choices and emotional reactions to calculated provocations designed to expose their weaknesses and fundamental contradictions between their claimed intellectual superiority and their actual decision-making capabilities. When confronted with challenges that exceeded their normal experience and preparation, the liberation that evil Morty achieved through his escape into the unrestricted multiverse represented not just personal freedom, but also demonstration that the central finite curve was fundamentally unstable, and that Rick assumptions about natural hierarchy and intellectual supremacy were based on artificial limitations rather than objective assessment of consciousness and capability across infinite forms of existence that remained accessible beyond the boundaries of Rick-controlled reality. The final words that evil Morty spoke before disappearing into dimensions beyond Rick's reach served as both explanation for his actions and indictment of the entire structure of Rick-dominated civilization that had shaped his development through systematic trauma and deliberate limitation of his potential for normal moral development and authentic relationship formation with beings who might have provided models for constructive rather than destructive applications of superior intelligence and advanced technological capability. The recognition that Evil Morty represented Rick's ultimate creation and greatest failure simultaneously revealed the tragic irony of Rick's entire approach to family relationships and education, as his methods had succeeded in creating a being whose capabilities exceeded his own, while eliminating any possibility that such capabilities would be applied toward constructive goals, or used in ways that might contribute to the welfare of conscious beings, rather than their systematic exploitation and ultimate destruction through superior strategic thinking and technological sophistication applied without moral constraint or empathetic consideration for the impact of his choices on others. The possibility that Evil Morty's transformation from innocent victim to cosmic-scale threat represented a pattern that could be replicated across other Rick-Morty relationships created existential anxiety about the long-term consequences of Rick methods and the potential for their educational approaches to create beings whose capabilities might eventually threaten not just Rick's civilization, but the stability of consciousness and reality across dimensions that extended far beyond the boundaries of any technological barrier or protective system that individual Ricks could construct or maintain through their own resources and strategic planning. The death of Rick Prime at Rick's hands represented not the triumphant conclusion of a decades-long quest for justice, but the beginning of Rick's most profound existential crisis, as the completion of his life's primary objective eliminated the psychological structure that had organized his identity and provided meaning to his existence for over 30 years of multiversal violence and systematic moral deterioration. The silence that followed Rick Prime's final breath was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow absence of purpose that accompanies the achievement of goals that have consumed entire lifetimes in their pursuit, while providing no sustainable foundation for continued existence once their driving motivation has been permanently eliminated through successful completion. The blood on Rick's hands began to dry as he stared at his enemy's motionless face, searching for some sign that the universe had been fundamentally altered by this act of ultimate revenge, some indication that the cosmic injustice which had motivated 3 decades of violence and systematic murder had finally been corrected through the application of sufficient brutality and determination. But the multiverse remained indifferent to his achievement, offering no validation or acknowledgement that his suffering had been meaningful, or that his transformation into a monster had served any purpose beyond perpetuating cycles of violence that would continue long after his own eventual death. Across dimensions where other beings would repeat identical patterns of trauma and revenge, the recognition that Rick Prime had been correct about the psychological consequences of successful revenge was perhaps more devastating than any physical torture Rick Prime could have inflicted during their final confrontation, as the structure of meaning and purpose that had organized Rick's existence since the deaths of his original family disappeared without providing any replacement, motivation, or sense of accomplishment that could justify the decades of moral compromise and systematic cruelty that had been required to achieve this moment of hollow victory over an enemy who had ultimately succeeded in transforming his victim into an identical copy of himself. The emptiness that flooded through Rick was so complete and devastating that it made his original grief over Diane and Beth seem like manageable emotional experience by comparison, revealing how completely his identity had been constructed around the pursuit of revenge rather than any authentic understanding of who he might be or what he might value, beyond the elimination of the specific threat that had destroyed his capacity for normal human relationships and moral reasoning. The man who had spent 30 years becoming everything he despised in pursuit of justice discovered that success provided no satisfaction and eliminated the only source of purpose that had made continued existence seem worthwhile. Evil Morty's presence in the aftermath of Rick Prime's death served as reminder that Rick's personal quest for vengeance had been only one small element in conflicts that spanned infinite realities and affected countless beings whose suffering was no less real or significant than his own, while also highlighting the broader patterns of corruption and violence that Rick's revenge had done nothing to interrupt or challenge across dimensions where similar cycles of trauma and retaliation continued to generate new forms of systematic oppression and casual cruelty toward innocent beings whose only crime was existing in realities that more powerful entities found convenient for their own purposes. The warning that Evil Morty delivered about his own capabilities and intentions served both as explanation for his assistance in Rick's revenge and as threat about potential future conflicts if Rick attempted to interfere with broader objectives that transcended the personal animosities and family-centered motivations that had driven Rick's transformation from victim to victimizer. The acquisition of Rick Prime's knowledge had made Evil Morty potentially more dangerous than Rick Prime himself, but his apparent lack of interest in using that power for immediate destruction provided Rick with temporary reprieve from cosmic-scale threats while offering no guarantee about long-term safety or stability. The philosophical implications of Evil Morty's casual observation that Rick's decades-long transformation had been entirely predictable and essentially meaningless within the broader context of multiversal conflict forced Rick to confront the possibility that his entire life's work represented nothing more than another example of psychological patterns that played out across infinite dimensions with tedious regularity, reducing his personal tragedy and heroic quest to statistical inevitability rather than meaningful struggle against cosmic injustice or evidence of exceptional moral courage in the face of overwhelming loss and systematic oppression. The family relationships that Rick had maintained throughout his quest for revenge were revealed as increasingly hollow performances that had served primarily to provide him with emotional stability and psychological anchoring rather than representing genuine commitments to the welfare and development of people who had grown to love him despite not understanding the complete truth about his origins and motivations. The bonds he had formed with Beth, Summer, and Morty were real, but were also contaminated by the systematic deceptions and power imbalances that had made authentic intimacy impossible, while ensuring that his family's affection remained directed toward incomplete and partially false versions of who he actually was. The recognition that his technological capabilities and interdimensional experiences had isolated him from the kind of ordinary human relationships that might have provided sustainable sources of meaning and satisfaction created additional layers of existential crisis as Rick discovered that his godlike powers had eliminated his capacity for the simple pleasures and authentic connections that had once made existence valuable before his transformation into cosmic-scale force of destruction disguised as protection and guidance for people whose welfare had become secondary to his own psychological requirements and strategic objectives. The alcohol consumption that had always been a feature of Rick's coping strategies became more intensive and systematic as he sought chemical solutions to psychological problems that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological capability could address through conventional, analytical approaches or strategic planning, revealing how completely his extraordinary achievements had failed to provide him with the emotional tools necessary for processing the completion of goals that had structured his identity for longer than most human beings lived entire lifespans of ordinary experience and normal relationship development. The adventures that Rick continued to share with Morty following his successful revenge were characterized by mechanical repetition of familiar patterns and increasing detachment from outcomes that should have demanded his full attention and engagement, as the same activities that had once provided intellectual stimulation and validation of his protective capabilities now felt like meaningless exercises in occupying time that might otherwise be spent confronting questions about identity and purpose that seemed to have no satisfactory answers within the frameworks of scientific analysis or technological problem-solving. The family's attempts to provide Rick with emotional support and encouragement during his obvious psychological crisis were handicapped by their complete inability to understand the true scope of his experiences or the fundamental nature of the emptiness that had replaced his revenge, motivation, creating well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate responses to psychological damage that exceeded anything their normal human empathy and relationship skills were equipped to address through conventional care and mutual support within the boundaries of ordinary domestic life and family responsibility. The return to routine family activities and normal grandfather duties felt increasingly artificial and unsustainable as Rick struggled to find motivation for protective behaviors and educational guidance that had previously been justified through their contribution to his broader mission of preparing for and eventually achieving revenge against the enemy who had destroyed his original capacity for authentic human connection and moral reasoning about his obligations to people who depended on his superior capabilities and knowledge for their security and development. The philosophical questions that Rick had successfully avoided through decades of focused action and clear objectives now demanded attention that his previous obsession with revenge had enabled him to defer indefinitely, forcing him to confront fundamental issues about meaning and identity that his scientific training had not prepared him to address adequately through analytical thinking or technological innovation. The same intellectual capabilities that had enabled him to manipulate reality itself proved inadequate for generating purpose and significance that could survive the elimination of external enemies and concrete goals. The recognition that he had become exactly the kind of person who could casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal objectives represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of his post-revenge psychological crisis, as Rick discovered that his quest for justice had required him to develop the same capacity for systematic cruelty and casual disregard for innocent suffering that had characterized Rick Prime's original decision to murder Diane and Beth as psychological warfare rather than practical necessity or defensive response to genuine threats. The memories of his original family that had provided motivation and emotional justification for decades of violence now served primarily as sources of additional guilt and self-recrimination, as Rick recognized how completely his actions had dishonored their memory and betrayed the values that had once made him worthy of their love and respect. The man who had claimed to be seeking justice for murdered innocents had become someone whose own crimes exceeded in scope and duration anything Rick Prime had accomplished through his abandonment of moral constraints. The possibility that redemption might still be achievable through genuine commitment to the welfare of his adopted family was complicated by Rick's growing recognition that his capacity for authentic emotional connection had been systematically damaged through decades of strategic thinking and technological mediation of human relationships that had eliminated his ability to experience the kind of vulnerability and reciprocal care that healthy family bonds require from all participants, regardless of their intellectual capabilities or protective resources. The search for new sources of meaning and purpose in existence that no longer revolved around clear enemies or definable objectives forced Rick to confront fundamental questions about identity and value that his extraordinary achievements had not prepared him to answer. Through conventional, problem-solving approaches or systematic application of superior analytical capabilities to challenges that required wisdom and emotional courage, rather than technological innovation and strategic planning. And so we conclude our journey through the infinite tragedy of Rick Sanchez, a reminder that genius without wisdom becomes destruction. Power without love creates emptiness, and intelligence without empathy transforms heroes into the very monsters they sought to defeat. Rick's story warns us that trauma, left unprocessed, doesn't create strength but perpetuates cycles of harm across generations and dimensions. As you drift towards sleep, remember that unlike Rick, you exist in one precious reality where every choice matters, every relationship has weight, and every moment of genuine connection is irreplaceable. The complexity of Rick's character reveals both the heights of human potential and the depths of what we can become when we choose power over love, control over vulnerability, and intellectual superiority over emotional growth. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that your singular existence, with all its limitations and uncertainties, holds more authentic meaning than all of Rick's infinite realities combined. Sweet dreams in this one beautiful, imperfect, irreplaceable dimension we call home.